Forgotten Weird Tales, Volume 3. The Last Incarnation, by Wallace West. He sat upon a lichen-covered stone, this grey ghost of what once had been a man, and stared greedily at the dim scene before him. It was a boy's bedroom into which he peered, as through a dark curtain. An 8-year-old tot lay writhing there in the torment of fever. Over him bent a grey-haired physician, his fingers upon the fluttering pulse. Nearby sat the parents, the mother asleep of exhaustion in her chair, the father, his eyes wide and dry, seeming to be throwing every effort of his will toward aiding the tortured little body on the bed. "Do you think he has a chance, Doctor?" whispered the father, brushing his hand across his face as though the moth-like wings of death had brushed him. "Perhaps," responded the physician. "This is the crisis. If he rallies, we can save him." Crouched on his rock close beside the tumbled bed, and yet as immeasurably distant from the room as if he had been on the farthest star, the shadow licked its lips and waited, talons half outstretched as if to throttle the frail form between the sheets. "Save him," sneered the phantom. "Oh yes, by all means, you mustn't let him die." He looked about him. Despite the fact that it was broad daylight in the sick room, this region in which the naked wraith crouched vulture-like upon its rock was shrouded in almost impenetrable gloom. Here and there could be discerned floating blobs of red phosphorescence. Not far away loomed what appeared to be a wall of rock which extended upward into the darkness. The faint gleams which now and then drifted by served to illuminate stretches of broken ground thickly strewn with boulders. The creature on the rock turned its attention again to the sick room. There was no change. A thermometer in the doctor's hand indicated that the fever had crept up a degree in the past hour. "Well, let it rise," smirked the ghost. "Let the heat creep up until it drive the boy's spirit, his soul, if you please, out into that vast land of shadows from which some return strangely changed, and others return not at all." The thing's talons suddenly curled in fury. Why should he wander in these cursed glades, playing silly mad pranks with those others who also had lost the right to possess that greatest of treasures, a body soft and warm and strong, capable of strange pleasures and sweeter vices? He deserved something better than this. He had been a king in his day. Still hungrily eyeing the bed, the ghost's fancy flitted back to those times when he had ruled, drunk deeply, lusted with fair women, slaughtered and schemed out in that pleasant world of sunshine, of which he now could catch glimpses only at high noon. He thought of sunny Italy when he, as Cesare Borgia, Duke of Romagna and Valentinois, had ruled with a bloody hand. That was clever, the way he had poisoned his pretty brother-in-law, the Duke of Bisceglie. He shouted with gleeful laughter at the memory. In the sick room, the father started and looked out of the window, as though he had heard some evil sound, whereat the ghost laughed harder. That was good, looking out the window, and he sitting right by the bed. His thoughts wandered back again into the old pleasant lives he had lived before the law of karma began to get its fateful hold upon him. 140 men and 6 women had climbed the scaffold while he ruled Florence as Cosimo de' Medici, besides the countless others who had died by the daggers and poisons of his gay assassins. That time when he had been an inquisitioner also sent his hands rasping against each other in glee. But the old brave days had gone from him during recent incarnations. The mountain of evil karma, which he had been building up since the days of Nineveh and Babylon, had borne him slowly downward during these last centuries. He shivered at the thought of the few short years when he had crawled and snivelled about the rice flats of Shantung as a coolie. His last life had been worse than that, though, spent among the off-scourings of Limehouse. And then, after a knife had been driven between his ribs in a waterfront brawl, he had awakened in this foul place, where it was borne upon him by the brood which inhabited the fetid hills and valleys, that there would be no more sweet bodies entrusted to his care. He had been tried, generation after generation, and found wanting. Each time his sins had dragged him a little farther down. Each time he had been given a chance to improve, and each time he had tossed it away for gold and fair women and power. This was the end, they said. He would linger on a few years or centuries or eons, and finally what was left of his soul would wither away, cut off as it was from the light of the sun, that giver of all life. And he would float about forever as one of those phosphorescent astral corpses which furnish the only light in this infernal region. Suddenly, the wraith leaped to its feet. On the bed, the boy had stirred and shouted incoherently in delirium. Had the time come? But the frenzy passed, and the onlooker resumed his seat on the slimy lava block. Well, he resumed his meditation. Why hadn't they let him know what he had been doing? Of what use this ability to remember his past blunders now that it was too late? He could have been a good man. Really, there had been much good in him, at least at first. Although a good many people died sudden and painful deaths, in Florence and Romagna and Valentinois, the people had built monuments to Borgia and de' Medici after their deaths. Wasn't the Inquisitioner upholding the hands of the Church? His mood changed. No, he had been lying to himself. He had gone down the wide purple way for the pure joy of it, bending people to his iron will to test his power, being cruel because life was short and one was a long time dead. And now, in this Ultima Thule, he had discovered suddenly that he had guessed wrong, that instead one was a long time alive. For a while, indeed, he had even enjoyed playing tricks on good spiritualists, giving malicious messages through their mediums, causing Ouija boards to write obscene words which startled gentle maiden ladies trying to get in touch with their dear departeds. But memories of the old brave days in Italy had spoiled such vicarious evil-doing for him. First, he had become bored. Then, when a leering companion whispered one day that there was no way out, that there would be no more incarnations, that he was in a hell more real than that envisioned by any inquisitioner, he had gone mad and howled about the stony glens and ledges like those poor things making their last struggle against dissolution into phosphorescence. But there was a way out. A cunning little thing with 3 legs and a gaunt, twisted head had whispered it to him one day, as he lay beating his head against a rock in the darkness. "Listen," it had simpered. "Wait until some human is in the last throes of sickness and has relaxed his will to live. Wait until he is driven out of his body and mind by burning fever. Then break the slender thread which binds body and soul together. Replace his spirit with your own. Many of us have done it. It means 1 life more, at least. And if you do it once, you can continue indefinitely. It is the one loophole in their armor. But if you try and fail, you will never have another chance." And the malformed thing had winked one roomy eye at him and slithered away. So he crouched here in the sick room, bent on doing the foulest deed of all his thousands of incarnations, bent on casting an innocent soul into outer darkness and inserting his soul spirit into its shrinking body. But he defended himself He had never been given a chance. Take that last life, when as Barry Spivens he had thieved from London wharfs and died with a rusty knife in his lung. What had started him that time on what the mission preachers called the downward path? His eyes envisioned the night when his drunken father had kicked him out of the house into a blizzard. He had crouched against the door, begging and pleading to come in, until he slumped down in the snow and knew nothing more. He had lost an ear and several fingers and toes from frostbite that night, and had consecrated himself to crime and murder as a revenge against the bitter world under the tutelage of a wharf rat who had found him and carried him home to a shack beneath the wharves. He fancied he could still hear his own childish voice whimpering, "Daddy, I'm cold, Daddy. Please let me in, Daddy. Please let me." What had once been Barry Spivens came to itself with a start. The poignancy of that memory had made him forget his purpose for a moment. In the sick room, the figure on the bed was lying quite still, while the doctor bent over it, an ear to the heart. Then Spivens heard again the cry, which he had thought to be an echo from his own childhood. "Please, Daddy, I'm awful cold. Oh, Daddy, where are you? I'm scared." The voice rose to a wailing, agonized scream. Spivens leaped from his rock. The expected had happened. Spirit and body had become divided by the intense heat of fever. The boy was wandering temporarily across the border of his own dark land. Now was his chance. Mouth drooling, fingers working, he leaped upon the bed, hurled his invisible form upon the boy's body, placed his lips against its mouth, tore at the slender but silver thread of ectoplasm, which still connected body and soul. But again came that wailing cry. "Daddy, Daddy, don't send me away in the dark, Daddy. Can't you hear me? Come and find your little boy." Involuntarily, Spivens turned his head from the task before him and glanced into the surrounding darkness of his ghost realm. Well, he knew that the boy, his eyes unaccustomed to the darkness, would wander farther and farther away, now that he had broken that slender ectoplasmic thread. The ghostly glow from the earthly room faintly lit the lichened rocks. They seemed covered with snow. "Daddy, I'm awful cold." The voice was fainter. Cursing in all the languages he had learned in his many lives, Spivens leaped from the bed. By God, he had never tortured children. He couldn't start now. He stumbled wildly over the rocks after the little white figure, which was wandering about far down the gorge, its hands outstretched like those of a blind person. Bobby Marshall opened his eyes and stared up into those of his father. The fever had broken. The crisis was past. "It's funny," the boy laughed weakly. "I thought I got lost. An ugly man found me and brought me home. He was cussing something awful, crying at the same time. Was he a good man, Daddy? You said only bad people swore." "He must have had some good in him anyway, if he brought you back," soothed the father, while the doctor smiled and poured some medicine into a glass. On the other side of the veil, the ghost of Barry Spivens howled with wolfish laughter. Turning from the scene of his defeat, he fled downhill into the blackest of the gorges, his passage stirring a group of phosphorescent blobs into apparent life for a moment. He had failed, and the three-legged thing said that after one failure, the barrier could not be broken. Suddenly, he stopped in amazement. The darkness of the bleak land, which had been unbroken by star or moon since his arrival, seemed lightening there across the ridges, as though in a faint foreshadowing of dawn. The Suicide by Malcolm Ford Henry. I am a stranger amongst men, for I stand in the midst of friends, and they know me not. I speak to them, and they stare at me askance, and some of them look startled and grow pale as they peer more closely into my face with an awed intake of breath. They are so amusing, these mortals, that I fain would laugh, though I dare not. For what would be their feelings if they could fathom my true identity? But they never will, they never can, and I walk among them safe, for I am a stranger, and my secret will never be known to the end of time. In my mind's eye I can see them now, and I conceal a smile as I think how they would draw away from me with an awful horror in their staring eyes, how the blood would run cold in their veins, and their bodies be racked with trembling in the terrible fear of the unknown, if they but knew. For I am dead, and I am alive. My earthly being is a grim paradox manipulated by the mischievous fingers of some strange fate. I go forth on the walks of men, and my body lives, but I am dead. I am dead. I know that my spirit cannot again be burdened with the weight of a human body, condemned to the horrible fate of a terrestrial existence. Then why am I here? Let me look back. Let my retrospective gaze dwell upon the past, and perhaps I can fathom the depth of my sin, and know why I must live, though I am dead. It began a long time ago, many years ago, and I was but a child, and played like other children. But was it like other children? I seemed to hear a soft voice saying, "My son, why must you be so rude to your friends?" And so, as time passed on, I played or remained more to myself. One there was who sought to befriend me, one who, as I now think, was as near an angel in human form as ever appeared on this earth. I repulsed her with the rest. That which adds most to my present anguish is the clarity with which these images of former times burn in my mind. I repulsed her with the rest. My self-centeredness, my colossal selfishness, my impetuosity, my imperiousness. Do I wonder that friends were lacking? I cared for naught, and my deformed soul spread in its path blackness and hatred. I had a mother whose love bounded upon fatuity. Now I have no one, nothing. I am lonely, I am lost. They loved me, and I repulsed them. I lost all my old associates and sought new. I sank lower and lower, yet they clung with strength born of desperation. They pled and fought to save me. In vain. I was ruthless, and I crushed in their hearts their boundless faith in me. And then I sought the grim relief, the balm of crushed hopes, restful oblivion, suicide. How sweet a thing the death of the despairing dream! Nothing but the grave, cool, dark, restful. So I turned to suicide. But that dream is deceptive, terribly deceptive. It was so amusing, so highly entertaining. I can remember it all so distinctly. It seemed I was discouraged and heartsick. But now I wonder if I could really have conceived the agony of the broken hearts that I caused to wake. It was night when the darkness and shadows of earth blended with the darkness of my soul, save that mine showed forth the blacker by contrast. Night is very close to death sometimes, and I, with all the despair of a wrecked and broken existence, gave myself up to that sweet dream which has been the elusive lure to myriad hordes that have passed before me. How dark it was! How dark was everything! I climbed high to the wretched attic of the house where I lived, for with a last faint glimmering of respect I had removed from the dwelling of my people to live apart in a wretched and destitute portion of the city, far away from the haunts of former days. How dark indeed was the attic, so that I needs must grope my way to the little window. There, without, was a huge iron hook, black and sinister, For what purpose I know not, far above the dark and silent street. To this I caught my rope. They found me at dawn, and I can see them now, for I did see them, their wide, distended eyes awed, terrified, and I can hear their cries at first, and later only the hushed, peculiar whispers that always betoken the presence of death. And then they came and cut me down, and drew me in with such care, with such dissimulation, as if they feared I might return to life and demand abruptly that I be left to my own devices. And they gathered around me, still conversing in the same awed whispers, for they thought I was dead. And then some very important gentleman was bending over me and inspecting me, and later, when all was quiet, someone was weeping over me, not passionately or wildly, just a gentle weeping, like the wind whistling among the leaves. All the while I stood to one side and watched the proceedings with consummate interest. I stood among the eager, curious crowd, and later I stood alone in the chamber when my mother came. It was not I, but only that lifeless clay that had been mine, and I, the real I, was unnoticed. But still I heard nothing, and indeed saw very little, and all the dark, the passionate, the corporeal despair seemed to have fled my mind, and left only a more hopeless and consuming sorrow. I walked forth and attempted to find rest, but in vain. I visited my old haunts, but no one noticed or appeared even to realize my presence, and when I spoke to those with whom I had sunk so low, they only stared at me as if I were an intruder. And here was one with whom I consorted most, a dirty, evil wretch, in whom I had always found something of a kindred spirit. I spoke, and he growled a surly reply, but at length, drawn by some strange attraction, he took notice of me, and we entered into conversation. "You knew him?" I asked. He understood and spat forth a vile curse. "Aye, for many years," he growled with sullen reluctance, "and a lower and more depraved dog never found the road to hell. God, that I should have associated with him, that I should even have known him. I'm bad, sir, about as low and filthy as you can find, but not like him, thank God, not like him. I never had a chance. He had a mother, and I saw her up there today. He had a mother, a friend, someone, anyone. I never had. He but cheated the hangman. I would have killed him sooner or later." I fled precipitously, my whole soul burning as if in truth consumed by the fires of hell. This from one of the lowest and most depraved villains that ever trod the dark and murky paths of the underworld. I suffered tortures, wandering on and on, knowing not where to betake myself, merely seeking, never finding. I sensed nothing but loss, felt no passion but grief, no sensation but sorrow and the oppressive, desolate emptiness of the world. At length I roused myself and took note of my surroundings, and was not a little surprised and agitated to find that I had wandered into the near vicinity of my childhood home. I attempted to restrain myself, but strode on as if fascinated, my eyes gazing eagerly upon the familiar surroundings, familiar, I say, and yet possessed of a strangeness that I was unable to fathom. How peaceful and quiet the old street appeared in the gentle rays of the late afternoon sun that had burst forth from its concealment behind the day's murky gloom. How peaceful and quiet indeed, contrasting so harshly with the grating turmoil of my soul. There was the old house, its every familiar line. I halted, horrified, frozen. Upon the familiar old door hung a wreath. For a long time I stood quite motionless, while thoughts raced madly through my mind, while I stared at that dismal symbol of death, of the thing that lay beyond those doors. My vision seemed to pierce those stolid, unimpassioned walls and see the thing that lay beyond, that stiff and clammy piece of clay that was I, and I was afraid. Trembling as if taken with the ague, I retraced my footsteps to the little grocery store on the corner, and entered hastily, as if to escape something intangible that my mind failed to grasp. Everything was as I remembered it. Behind the counter stood the bent and shrunken figure of the merchant that I had known all my life, but older, much older than when I had last seen him. For a moment I thought he knew me, that unlike others he sensed what his bleary old eyes could not discern. "A death," I said in a voice that was hoarse and unreal. "I see there has been a death." "A death," he repeated vaguely. "Yes, there has been a death. Our loss, hell's gain. God, he was bad. For his own sake it was well. But his mother, sir, she is a good woman. She didn't deserve this. Her boy, her own boy, if it could only have been otherwise." "You knew him then?" "Knew him, yes. The most despicable scoundrel that ever lived. It was his wilfulness and hot-headed intolerance. He had every opportunity. If he had only died at birth, God knows the world would have been better." The sun had sunk below the horizon, and a cold, damp wind blew from the north. It seemed that things had changed suddenly to match the dismal foreboding of my mind. Fitful glares of lightning lit up the western sky, and low, almost inaudible moans of thunder reached my super-acute senses. I hesitated before the house, and the black wreath seemed to oppress, to burden me. Then it receded as the door opened softly, and she stood before me. For a moment of utter silence, we faced each other. Silence broken only by that angry, far-away murmur of thunder. Then, very slowly and softly, I stepped within and closed the door. But she continued to gaze at me, and spoke in a low, apathetic voice. "There has been a death. Who are you?" "I am an old friend of his," I lied. No one had ever been his more bitter enemy. "His mother. She is here?" "Yes, there." She followed me into the large, poorly lighted library. The mother gazed at me from dry eyes that seemed vaguely to misunderstand, and I had a feeling of an animal that had been beaten, not knowing why. The younger woman was making some explanation that reached my ears but made no impression. Then the mother came forward to grasp my hand, and I found myself making answers to her queries. "Yes, I knew him well, many years." "But he was not really bad? Oh, tell me that he was not." I glanced beyond her at the girl, and saw in her eyes an expression of pleading. "There have been many exaggerations," I replied evasively. "Oh, he couldn't have been as bad as they say. He couldn't." For a moment, I thought she was about to break down. Presently, however, she composed herself, and inquired in a stronger voice, "Perhaps you would like to see the body?" "God, no!" I exclaimed, and then, in a gentler voice, "No, I would prefer not." "Ah, he does not look so bad as that," she protested, cut by my thoughtless exclamation. "He does not look so bad. They have altered his appearance. He is younger, more as he was in the old days. In the old days, when he was my little boy. It seems such a long time, so many years, but I have been very patient, very brave. It has been a long time, sir, a very long time since he was a little boy, my baby with his baby laugh and bright eyes, just like other women's babies, and I loved him too, just as they love their children, and I watched him and prayed for him, watched him grow. Oh, how could I know? How could I? God help me. I wanted to be calm, to take it bravely, but he's still mine, still my little baby." And she broke into passionate weeping that told of a restraint broken for the first time. I was stunned, overwhelmed. Even despite the morning episode, I had expected something else. Denunciation, calm regret, anything but this. I turned wildly to the hall, but she was before me, and as I gazed into her face, at once quiet and pathetically pleading, I felt a recurrence of the old passion that the years had hardened, obliterated. "I am sorry," she said with the old gentleness. "I am sorry that you should have been here. It is the first time she has broken, but, oh, why had it to happen? She had loved him better than life itself. And oh, the months, the years we fought to save him, and every night I pray for him. But it is useless. Oh, God, it is useless." Useless. Aye, useless. How utterly vain she could not even dream. Out into the Stygian darkness and fury of the tempest I staggered, on and on, seeking nothing now, finding nothing. It is so dark, so terribly dark, and I am alone with my sorrow. Within me dwells the only lasting, the eternal hell. I am lonely, so lonely, and lost. Warning Wings by Arlton Eadie. "Steady, sir, please don't do that." Quietly as the words were uttered, their tone of urgent entreaty was such that I stopped dead, and allowed my hand, already raised, to crush the moth which had for the past half-hour been blindly dashing itself against the bulb of the electric table-lamp, to fall limply to my side. Surprised at the unexpected exclamation, and secretly somewhat amused at his evident concern for the life of the fluttering insect, I turned and faced the speaker. He was a fresh arrival at the hotel, for his face was unfamiliar to me. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed, pointed grey beard, his features tanned to that warm, even tone which only the sea can give. One does not need to spend many hours in the neighbourhood of the Southampton waterfront before becoming accustomed to the type to which he belonged. Evidently he was an officer of one of the ocean liners, which are to be counted by the score in the docks nearby. There was a flicker of amusement in his keen grey eyes as he stepped forward in answer to my look of surprise. "Seemingly this little wanderer of the night has incurred your displeasure," he observed, pointing to the moth which had now renewed its frantic dashes against the brightly lit globe. "It seemed so determined to beat its life out that I thought it only kindness to end its misery." I shrugged. The stranger shook his head slightly. "There is another way." He stepped toward the lamp, and after several attempts managed to catch the little creature between his capped hands. Then, holding it with infinite tenderness, he crossed to the open window and allowed it to flutter away into the summer night. As he turned, after shutting the window, I saw that he was regarding me with a queer little half-smile. "You may think it strange that I should take the trouble to preserve the life of an insect that another man would crush without a second thought," he said. "But I have a fondness for moths, especially of that particular kind. Oh, you mustn't run away with the idea that I'm a learned entomologist," he went on with a laugh. "As a matter of fact, I do not know the scientific name of the species, although its common designation is, I believe, the ghost moth. No, sir, my action just now was purely sentimental. The sight of those tiny fluttering wings brought back the memory of a strange adventure which I had in mid-Atlantic many years ago." A far-away expression had crept into his eyes, only to vanish the next moment as he turned again to me and resumed briskly, "If I tell you the story, it may serve for both explanation and excuse for my unwarrantable intrusion just now." I hastened to assure him that no excuse was necessary, but at the same time I hinted rather strongly that I should be glad to hear the account of what had happened. To confess the truth, I was not a little curious to know why such a strong bond of sympathy existed between this clear-eyed, matter-of-fact man of the world and the little white moth. Sailors' yarns are seldom uninteresting to a landsman, and occasionally they are true as well. Whether this one comes in the latter category, I am unable to guarantee, but I can vouch for the fact that the teller of it did not look like a man who would gain any satisfaction from twisting the ankle of a casual stranger. As I listened to the story being told in his deep, earnest voice, glancing occasionally into the speaker's frank, bronzed face, I know that I believed every word of it. At the present time, I am in command of the RMSS. He mentioned the name of a famous Atlantic flyer which had arrived at Southampton the previous day. But at the time of which I am about to speak, some 20 years since, I was in charge of a smaller vessel belonging to the same line. I was a youngish man then, as liner captains go, and she was my first command. You must not imagine that I was nervous on that account, for I'd been in the ferrying trade ever since I'd taken my third mate's ticket, and I flattered myself that I knew the lane blindfold. I suppose it sounds strange to you when I speak of a lane across the Western Ocean. If you talk about the sea to the average landsman, he conjures up a vision of the trackless deep, a phrase which he has learnt from story writers who have more poetical imagination than actual sea-going experience. True, there was a time when the shipmaster was left free to set his course by the most direct route from port to port, and especially was this so in the days when the competition between the different shipping companies led their captains to strain every nerve to secure the speed record for their particular ships. But all that is changed now, with the furnaces of a modern liner eating up a ton of coal every 1.5 minutes, to say nothing of the food and wages bills mounting up. It is essential for the captain to maintain speed, and the man who takes a 43,000-tonner at 25 knots through the zone of drifting icebergs and the fogs which lay over the Grand Banks in summer is simply asking for trouble. Consequently, 2 lanes are marked out on his chart: the northern and most direct sea passage, to be followed when the icebergs are bound up by the Greenland winter and the fog zone off the Grand Banks is of smaller area, and the southern, which is calculated to pass outside the limit to which the bergs drift before melting, and to avoid the larger fog area over the banks. For the Southampton boats, the course is set from the Lizard. Those coming from Liverpool set theirs when they drop the Fastnet Light off the southwest coast of Ireland, while those coming north about through the Pentland Firth steer from a spot well to the nor'ard of the rocky islet of Rockall. And once the course is set, the helm is not shifted unless it is in response to a signal of distress. It is necessary for me to make these details quite clear in order for you to appreciate the position of difficulty in which I found myself during the particular voyage I am about to describe. It was June when we sailed from this port, so we were due to take the southern route. We stood down channel until the Bishop Light was winking away on our starboard beam. It stands on an outlying reef of the Scilly Isles, and is the last beacon you pass sailing west. Then the course was set west 3/4 south, which brought the ship into the usual summer route. A little over 3 days' steaming brought us into the neighborhood of 35 degrees of longitude west of Greenwich. At this point, our track met the track of the Liverpool and Queenstown boats, and, according to schedule, our bows were pointed farther south, which made our course west-southwest. You must understand that I'm describing the track we followed 20 years ago. Since the Titanic disaster in 1912, the route has been altered, so that it now swings more to the southward until it reaches the same latitude as the Azores, after which it curves north again to New York. Well, we shifted our helm, as I have said, about 1 bell in the first watch, 8:30 p.m. shore time, and shortly afterward I came off the bridge to turn in. I took a last look round before going below. It was one of those perfect nights which make passengers think that a sailor's life is all beer and skittles. The ship was thrashing her way over the gentle swell with scarce a tilt showing on her long lines of decks. The stars shone bright in the cloudless sky. The slight following breeze was hardly strong enough to lift the drooping folds of the ensign at our stern. It seemed that, on such a night, the most nervous of new-fledged captains might sleep in peace. Certainly no thought of sudden and unexpected disaster was in my mind when I threw myself down on my cot to sleep. But for some unaccountable reason sleep would not come to me. I tossed restlessly from side to side, got up and opened the ports of my cabin, closed them again, tried the old trick of counting the steady beats of the throbbing propeller, but all in vain. In spite of my effort to overcome it, the sense of expectant wakefulness seemed to increase rather than diminish. At last I gave up the struggle, and, switching on the light, took a book from the rack and settled myself to read. It was then that I noticed, for the first time, a vague sound mingling with the familiar noises of the ship. At first it seemed nothing more than a soft, intermittent tapping, but as I continued to listen, I noticed that the same number of taps was repeated again and again. Subconsciously at first, but soon with awakened interest, I realized that the sounds fitted into certain letters of the Morse code. I laid the book aside and sat up, listening. Tap, 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 tap. I raised my eyes to the spot whence the sound proceeded, and at once saw what was causing it. Attracted by the light, a tiny white moth had entered the porthole, and was now fluttering frantically against the illuminated dial of the telltale compass that was fixed in the ceiling above my bed. The soft tapping had been caused by the creature dashing itself against the glass in its effort to reach the light within. I smiled to myself as I saw the commonplace explanation of the sounds which had so puzzled me, but at the same time I could not help being struck by the fact that the noise it was making was strangely like the Morse code. But I was in no mood to be kept awake by so trivial a thing. Picking the towel from the rack, I mounted on the cot and raised my hand to sweep the little creature out of existence, even as you were about to crush that other moth in this room a few minutes since. But just as I was about to strike, the moth's flutterings began afresh. Tap, 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 tap. I stood like a man turned to stone as the real meaning of this chance-spelt signal rushed upon me. It was SOS, the sailor's call for help. Nor was this all. I had already noticed that the creature had come to rest in the same position every time it had finished the 9th stroke, but now I saw that its head was resting on the compass at almost exactly the same point where our present course lay. The difference was only 1/4 of a point to the southward. That is to say, we were heading west-southwest, whereas the course indicated by the moth was west-southwest, quarter south. Even as I stood staring, the signal was repeated. The light, feathery wings beat the air once more. Again came the 3 rapid taps, the pause, the 3 slower taps, another pause, and then the 3 final taps in quick succession. Again, the creature alighted on the glass with its head resting on the same quarter point of the compass. Now, I'm not naturally a superstitious man, but I don't mind admitting that I felt a very curious feeling stealing over me as I stood alone in that cabin and watched that little grayish-white insect spell out the signal, which is never sent out unless a vessel be in dire straits, and then come to rest pointing so unerringly to a course so near our own. It was useless for me to try to persuade myself that it was pure coincidence, that the 3 fluttering taps might be the natural movements of the moth, that there might be something on the covering glass of the compass which would account for the thing always seeking the same spot. Try as I might, I could not get it out of my head that the little moth was trying to tell me to shift my helm 1/4 of a point to the south. Still, one does not act on impulse when in charge of an ocean liner, nor does one depart from the specified track without good cause. First of all, I must make sure that my imagination was not playing a trick on me. I slipped on my uniform and quietly made my way aft to the first officer's berth. MacAndrew was a hard-headed and eminently practical Scot, in whose sound common sense I felt I could trust in such a case as this. He was asleep, but his eyes snapped open the instant I laid my hand on his shoulder. "Anything wrong, sir?" he cried as he recognized me. "Not exactly," I answered, "but I want your advice on a little matter that's been troubling me a bit." Mac looked a little surprised, but he was a good deal more so when I led the way to my cabin and pointed to the compass. "Why, it's nothing but a wee bit moth," he cried. "They call them gasty flutters up where I was born, them being white, you see." I interrupted him by holding up my hand. "Watch and listen," I said, purposely refraining from telling him what to expect, in case it should unconsciously influence his judgment. As I spoke, a slight movement began to agitate the soft, downy wings, and presently, tap, 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 tap. MacAndrew glanced round at me when the wings had become still. If I'd have heard that on a wireless receiver, I'd have thought I was listening to an SOS, he said slowly. "It's been rapping out the same 3 letters for the past half hour," I told him, "and every time it has come to rest over the same point of the compass." He craned his neck upward, and I saw him start. "God preserve us," he jerked out. "The wee beastie is heading within a quarter of a point of our aim course." I nodded silently, for the moth was again repeating its strange message. "West-southwest, quarter south," I read, as the frail wings ceased quivering, "and I'm very much tempted to follow the new course." He gave me a long, searching look before replying. "Yon is a matter about which nae man can advise another, sir," he said at length. "It's something clean beyond the rules of seamanship and navigation. But speaking for myself, sir, if I were in command of this packet, I'd shift my helm to the quarter where your poor beastie seems trying to guide us." I stood for a long while in thought after he had finished speaking. A young master mariner can make or mar his reputation on his first trip. I had been given the command over the heads of older and more experienced men, and I well knew that my conduct would be closely and jealously watched, and, if needs be, criticized. If I were to veer out of the usual track and ill came of it, I would be a marked man for the rest of my life, and I'd seen too many out-of-work shipmasters kicking their heels round the agents' offices not to know what that meant. On the other hand, there was the little white moth fluttering out the message that no sailor worth his salt can listen to unmoved, and pointing persistently to the south. I was not a man who loved taking chances, but for good or ill, I determined to take one then. I turned briskly. "Pass the word to the quartermaster, Mr. MacAndrew," I ordered. "The course is west-southwest, quarter south." "Quarter south it is, sir," the old Scotsman returned, with glistening eyes. Then he raised his hand and touched his cap reverently. "May the good Lord reward you if you're doing right, and may he help you if you're not." He went out on the bridge, and a few seconds after I saw the lubber line, which coincides with the head of the ship, veer round until it came abreast of the spot where the moth was resting, showing that we had swung on to the new course. Almost at the same moment, as though it knew that its mission had been accomplished, the little moth fell to the deck, quivered for an instant, and then was still forever. I gently lifted the little dead messenger, placed it in an empty matchbox, and stowed it away in my locker. I have it still, and sometimes when things go wrong and the world seems to be just a huge ant-hill of humanity ruled by blind chance and brute instincts, I take out that matchbox and look upon the tiny white moth that came to me in mid-Atlantic, and my faith is restored. For 36 hours after changing course, we sighted the old Rangoon, outward bound and crowded and blazing from bridge to stern. Over 1,000 souls lived to bless the change of course indicated by that little winged messenger, and among them was the lady who is now my wife. And that's why I have a tender spot in my heart for the little light-blinded creatures which flutter in out of the night. The Lure of Atlantis by Joel Martin Nichols, Jr. There have been so many queer yarns in the newspapers about the sinking of the Nautilus that I, being skipper of the four-masted schooner Brant, which picked up Professor Charles Randolph, her only survivor, had better set down what really did happen down there in the Sargasso Sea. The Nautilus was a steam yacht owned by Professor Amos Tyrrell, a wealthy English naturalist who had built a laboratory on the Cornish coast for the study of fish and seaweed. He and Randolph, who had been his assistant for 20 years, sailed in the Nautilus on the 5th of last February to do some research work in the Sargasso. About this time, the Brant was rounding the Horn out of Santiago, Chile, with a load of nitrates bound for Charleston, South Carolina. We struck a blow off the River Platte, and my old hooker lost her rudder. When things cleared up a bit, we found ourselves pretty well out in the South Atlantic, but we rigged a jury rudder and headed northwest, figuring on dropping into some Cuban port to refit. We struck the Sargasso about 15 days later, and one fine morning we picked up this Professor Randolph, who was bobbing about in the open sea without the sign of a stick to keep him up. He was delirious when we brought him aboard, but after he came to his right senses, he told me the queerest yarn I ever heard in my life, and I've heard some rather good ones in the 40 years I've been following the sea. At first I put him down as crazy, but we'd no sooner got him aboard than hell began a-popping all around us right there on the Brant. When she finally got through, with 2 of her sticks missing and some of those hard-boiled birds in the forecastle a-praying to the Almighty to save 'em from the devils of the deep, I made up my mind that maybe he wasn't so crazy after all. Then I had Randolph write down his story in his own words. I turned the original over to the authorities, and I suppose the British Admiralty has it now, but I copied the whole thing, word for word, in the Brant's log. The professor headed his story in big letters. Statement of Dr. Charles Williams Randolph concerning the sinking of the Nautilus. And this is how it read. Captain Andrew Waters of the schooner Brant has asked me to write down the story of the cruise of the Nautilus, and of what befell her unfortunate crew and my colleague, Dr. Amos Tyrrell. And since it seems certain now that the Brant is not to suffer the fate of the Nautilus, I have agreed to comply with his request. It is perhaps unnecessary for me to delineate the relationship between Dr. Tyrrell and myself, since we were students of natural science together at the University of Edinburgh 20 years ago. His accomplishments in the field of natural history, his studies and deductions from his exhaustive researches in the Seven Seas, his magnificent laboratory at Cornwall, all have given him an international fame which needs no emphasizing here from me. Suffice it to say that I may designate myself merely as an unworthy assistant in his great work, a humble satellite reflecting but a dim gleam from the splendor of his genius. The world, when it has read this statement, will realize that these are strange words coming now from me, in view of the discord, mild term, between Dr. Tyrrell and myself, which ended in the horrifying fate of the Nautilus. It was a discord which really had its inception 5 years ago, when Dr. Tyrrell exhibited the first signs of a divided interest in his life work, an interest which led him away from his studies of undersea life, and eventually found him devoting a large share of his time to archaeological research. He began this course by taking extended trips to Egypt and Central America, where he indulged in a comparative study of prehistoric architectures found on the 2 continents, professing to find between them a most amazing and wholly unaccountable similarity. Being engrossed with our original labors, I paid little attention to his assertions, until one day he came to me with the astounding announcement that he had evolved a tenable theory for the existence of the lost continent of Atlantis. In support of it, he produced a vast number of photographs and other data, which purported to show that the pyramids found in the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula were in reality small copies of the mighty piles found in Egypt, and that in other ways he had established an unanswerable argument for there being, in prehistoric times, a bridge of land between the African and American continents. It was his further contention that this land connection was the lost Atlantis, sunk beneath the waves of the South Atlantic Ocean by some stupendous cataclysm. Egypt, in the heyday of its power, he asserted, had been naught but a poor outpost of Atlantis, reflecting only a dim glimmer of the splendors of that lost continent. I must confess that I was bitterly disappointed in my colleague's new activities, for I had always held that the existence of Atlantis was a matter for metaphysical speculation, and not one to engage the serious attention of men engrossed in the more objective sciences. I was gravely considering the necessity of voicing this conviction in the form of a gentle reproof to Dr. Tyrrell, when he came to me one day in great excitement, brandishing before my eyes a piece of twisted metal. "I have it, Randolph," he fairly shouted at me. "This proves my theory. We've found Atlantis." Dr. Tyrrell was not given to practical joking, so I accepted the proffered metal, although with a preconceived skepticism. It was, I should say, a bit of framework done in bronze, very like the lintel of a door. There are many similar pieces in the temples of ancient Egypt. Carved on its surface, however, were some peculiar hieroglyphics, which on closer observation I recognized as a type of cuneiform writing. "Is this one of your Egyptian finds?" I queried, somewhat testily. He waved me down in derision. "This," he said excitedly, "was pulled out of the South Atlantic Ocean on the flukes of an anchor dropped overboard by the tramp steamer Pole Star." "Ah, yes," said I, "a bit of submerged driftwood." "Nonsense," he shouted. "Let me tell you about it. This vessel was caught in a storm somewhere down there. I've got the exact bearings. And her anchor was carried overboard by a large sea. It ran out almost the whole length of the cable before they could arrest it. When they finally had opportunity to attend to it, they found that they were anchored. Think of it, Randolph. Anchored out there in the Sargasso Sea, where the Admiralty chart set the depth at nearly a mile. And when they got the anchor up, they found this bit of bronze twisted about one of the flukes." "A hoax," I exclaimed. "They fooled you for a good price." "I paid them nothing," he retorted. "They believed there was some subterranean upheaval throwing up a submerged island which by chance caught their anchor. But this bit of bronze never came from any submerged wreck, as they believe. It came from one of the hilltop temples of the lost Atlantis. I've been able to translate this inscription. Do you know what it means?" I admitted caustically that I did not. "It means," he continued, "Winona, fair princess of Atlantis. There is something more, but it is unintelligible. Winona was the daughter of the last king of Atlantis." "Small good it will do you," I put in. "You can never prove it." "Indeed?" he retorted. "Then you may be interested to know that I've ordered the Nautilus to be ready for sea in 8 days. I'm going down there with our diving equipment, and if it isn't too deep, I'm going to explore this watery kingdom. You may come if you wish." To make a long story short, I must say here that I was in reality more interested than I cared to admit, and it took no great urging to get me to go along. As Dr. Tyrrell had pointed out, we were already well equipped for the contemplated cruise. The Nautilus, Dr. Tyrrell's yacht, was virtually a floating laboratory in which we had spent many happy months in our explorations of the 7 seas. On board was every apparatus imaginable to aid in deep-sea work. Many of the devices had been invented or perfected by my colleague. Chief among these were 2 of the latest type diving suits, glass, steel, and rubber affairs capable of withstanding excessive undersea pressures. Air was furnished to the wearer from tanks at the shoulders, and thus the danger of entangling lifelines and air hose was eliminated. Now, as I write, it seems to me almost a catastrophe that these invaluable accessories have been lost forever to the world. We steamed out of our harbour at Bournwell on the 5th of February. Our voyage was uneventful, and 3 weeks later we were over the spot indicated in the nautical bearings furnished us by the captain of the Pole Star. How well I remember that morning of our first sounding. How well I remember my own excitement raised to the zenith by the enthusiasm of Dr. Tyrrell. And how well I remember the look on his face and the leap in my own heart when our sounding lead showed bottom at 280 feet, even as the captain of the Pole Star had said. We had indeed found a submerged island. Whether it was Atlantis, I was still skeptical. On the following morning, after having made the necessary preparations, we donned our diving suits and dropped over the side of the Nautilus into the sea. The spot, as I have already indicated, was approximately in the middle of the Sargasso Sea, but fortunately the surface of the ocean about us, for the space of almost a square mile, was free of the encumbering marine growth so peculiar to these waters. Thus, throughout the middle part of the day, we expected to have the full value of the sun, thereby rendering unnecessary our electric searchlights, which were at best rather cumbersome and unsatisfactory for deep-sea work. Once in the sea, with our arms locked together, we sank down, down. The water proved to be even clearer than we had hoped. Indeed, it was almost abnormally transparent, and the shafts of the sun bade fair to penetrate quite as far as we desired to go. We must have been descending slowly for nearly 5 minutes, when suddenly Dr. Tyrrell loosed his arm and pointed with his gloved finger into the distance at my back. Turning my head within my helmet, I saw, with a tremendous leap of my heart, that we were floating slowly down beside a beautiful, tapering pinnacle cut in a stone which appeared to be marble. Almost immediately, other and lesser pinnacles arose gradually about us, all of them glowing with vari-colored tints under the penetrating rays of the sun. Peering at some of the nearer ones, I saw that they were not some mere basaltic upheaval. They had been built by human hands. We had found Atlantis. The luminous glow from above had grown only slightly dimmer when we came gently to rest on what appeared to be the roof of some gigantic building, a roof which on closer observation I saw was of a thick but lucid crystal. All about us, on a kind of ridgepole of this temple, if such it was, I saw bits of curiously carved statuary, some of them apparently broken off by the undulating action of the deep-sea currents. I would have paused over them in wonderment had it not been for Dr. Tyrrell, who, without hesitation, walked deliberately to the edge of the roof, where we again dropped off into the open water. A moment later, we filtered gently to rest on a wide landing in a magnificent set of marble stairs. Glancing up with thumping heart, I realized that we were standing at the very threshold of a splendid marble temple. I would that I had the time or the talent for describing the magnificence, the awe-inspiring beauty of that scene. The walls towering up before us were of purest marble, slightly tinted a bluish-green by the intervening water. Above our heads, the shafts of the sun, only slightly dimmed by the lesser depth, played on those lofty spires with all the colors of the rainbow, tints shading away in all degrees of green, yellow, red, purple, and blue. All about us on the stairs, standing for the most part on pedestals of what appeared to be pure gold, was some of the most exquisite statuary I have ever seen. Save for a few pieces carved in the form of some hideous beast, the like of which I have never seen on earth, the majority of the effects were extremely pleasing to the eye, and were evidently from the hands of the sublimest masters, who had far surpassed the best of Phidias or Praxiteles, or the unknown author of the Venus of Milos. And yet the effect in totality was marred, as I have indicated, by the weird shapes of some of the beasts. Then, too, there was a peculiar type of fungus growing over them, a kind of seaweed unknown to me, which writhed and moved about the statuary like a thing alive. Some of it seemed actually to be coiling and uncoiling about the throat of a beautiful maiden, exquisitely carved in a pinkish marble, standing near us on the stairs. While I was charmed with the statuary, I must admit from the outset that this strange marine growth made me shudder. It was too uncannily alive. Even as we walked up the steps, it recoiled from our footsteps to make way for us, but on looking back I noted that it returned again to its original resting place and seemed, in fact, to be following us up to the top. At the head of the flight we found a pair of magnificent bronze doors, fortunately wide open. Oddly enough, both were heavily embossed with the figure of a winged animal, not unlike the Egyptian Sphinx, part woman, part beast, and part bird. Although the doors were open, there was a tangle of that disgusting marine growth across the threshold, and Dr. Tyrrell, with a gesture of impatience, drew his knife to hack away into the place. But even as he reached out to seize the stuff, it recoiled and parted of its own accord, thereby giving us ready access. Behind the bronze doors was a magnificent hall or foyer. I do not know how else to describe it. Halfway down on our right was an open doorway leading into another and more spacious hall. Light from the ocean surface filtered into the place through the crystal roofs, but its intensity had been so greatly dimmed by the depth that we could not see clearly for more than 20 feet ahead of us. Keeping well to the right so that we should not lose our way, we suddenly came face to face with a wall of the temple, noting with a gasp of admiration that its surface was covered with beautiful murals, apparently done in gold leaf with backgrounds of silver and a substance which might be ivory. Following the murals to the very foot of the walls, I noted that the floor on which we were walking had been done in the most delicate and intricate of mosaics. We feasted our eyes on these beauties for several minutes, and then began following the wall at our right. I was in the act of commenting mentally on the absence of any furnishings or statuary in the hall proper, when suddenly there loomed before us in the greenish gloom a sizable marble cubicle. Coming nearer, we saw that this was only the first of a series, mortised to the walls and standing about as high as our waists. A farther approach showed us that they were in reality a row of marble bins, to use a prosaic term. But what bins they were! What beauty! What contents! Pounds and pounds of jewels in every hue of the rainbow. In one cubicle I buried my arms up to the elbow in the finest of rubies. From another I saw Dr. Tyrrell hold up a double handful of glittering emeralds, and diamonds, a king's ransom in those alone. My natural cupidity had seized hold of me, and I was for taking some of the gems with us, but I noted that Dr. Tyrrell, always the scholar, had tossed his jewels back into place, and then I shamefacedly followed his example. As we wandered farther down the hall, he informed me in the sign language we had developed for undersea work that he had concluded this was a mortuary chapel built on one of the Atlantean hilltops. If such it proved to be, he pointed out, we should soon come upon human remains, as the Atlanteans were credited by ancient chroniclers with having developed an amazing method of preserving their dead. He was walking to one side and a little ahead of me as he imparted this information, and he had scarcely finished when I saw him suddenly pause, peer ahead into the gloom, and then hurry forward, signing me to follow. In the greenish half-light I saw that we were approaching the end of the hall, and that up against the wall was what appeared to be a huge marble altar. And then I saw Winona, Princess of Atlantis. She was laid out there in her crystal tomb. Her eyes, with their glorious blue, were open and smiling. The roses were still in her cheeks. The very pink was in her fingernails. I suppose I was a bit wrought up, for I could have sworn that she moved and smiled up at us. Dr. Tyrrell had dropped on one knee, his hands clasping the sides of her bier, and now he crouched there, peering through the glass of his helmet at this lovely handiwork of God. I do not know whether he cried out with the marvel of it, but I know that I did, for the sound echoed and re-echoed within the confines of my glass and rubber prison. Never before had I seen so beautiful a creature. Her tomb, or casket, all of clear crystal, was tipped upward so that she appeared to be reclining there, gazing out upon the hall below her. I could see every outline of her figure, every lineament of her features. I recognized immediately the Egyptian strain in the firm, straight nose, the perfect curve of the somewhat full lips, and the exquisitely modelled chin, tender yet imperiously firm, but withal, shall I say it, slightly cruel. Her figure, slightly swathed in a filmy lace of gold, was perfection, possibly a trifle fuller at the hips than we are wont to approve nowadays, but perfect nevertheless. I have spoken of her contours as purely Egyptian, but here the comparison ceases, for your ancient Egyptian was of a swarthy race, but this woman of Atlantis was of the fairest, with wide-opened eyes as blue as the cornflowers in our native England, and high-piled hair as yellow as the golden fillets with which it was bound. I can see my reader shudder at the thought of thus gazing upon the dead, but I can tell him the sight of the lovely Winona thus affected neither Dr. Tyrrell nor myself. I do not know how long we stood there, gazing at this exquisite creature, but it must have been a very long while, for my heart began to labor and my head began to throb in a way which told me that the oxygen in the tanks at our backs must be getting low. Almost at that identical moment I felt an uncanny tightening and drawing sensation about my legs and ankles. Glancing quickly downward, I saw something that left me cold with horror. That loathsome seaweed, unnoticed by us, had crept into the chapel, and was now seemingly growing in all directions over the floor. Some of it had entwined about my ankles, producing upon them a peculiar drawing and tugging sensation, similar to that felt by a person walking in the undertow on a wave-washed beach. A swift glance over to my colleague produced in me a second and greater wave of horror. I saw him there, lost in contemplation of the sleeping beauty, and utterly unmindful that this hideous creeping thing had gone farther on him than it had on me. Indeed, it bade fair to cover his whole body. During the course of my 20 years' exploration of the world under the sea, I have had many occasions to be terrified by the activities of plant and animal life there, but never have I been so submerged in horror as when I beheld that slimy weed squirming and twisting over our bodies. I must have cried out with the shock of it, for my head began to ring within my helmet, and I clutched frantically for the knife at my belt, with the intention of hacking away the stuff at my ankles. My panic was short-lived, however, for no sooner had I reached for the weed than it uncoiled itself of its own free will, seeming actually to recoil at the dull gleam of my weapon. Then, in 2 strides, I was at Dr. Tyrrell's side, intending to shake him back to a realization of our danger. Twice I grasped his shoulder, before he paid the slightest attention to me, absorbed as he was in his contemplation of the smiling beauty in her crystal tomb. Finally, on my last somewhat rough importunity, he turned suddenly about and struck at me angrily with his hand. Almost immediately, he must have regretted this act, for he signed to me that he was sorry, that he had forgotten himself for the moment. I told him our oxygen was getting low, and pointed to the seaweed on his body, expecting him to be as horror-stricken as I had been. Oddly enough, however, he did not seem to mind it, for he got to his feet, and then, to my profound astonishment, the weed slowly unfolded and let him free. With a last glance at our recumbent beauty, we started from the hall, the seaweed drawing apart before our steps until a wide lane extended before us to the door. Outside, on the terrace, we prepared to loose our weights for our journey to the surface, but here a new and greater horror struck me. Glancing down from our high point of vantage before the temple doors, I saw in the mass of seaweed to the right and left of the staircase the ribs, the broken stumps, the twisted sternplates, the battered superstructures of many sunken ships. There must have been at least 100 of them piled together helter-skelter, and heaven knows how many more lay farther down in the valley, where the rays of the sun did not penetrate. I do not know how long we would have paused there, gazing upon this scene of desolation, had it not been that the increased difficulty of breathing warned us we could tarry no longer. Accordingly, we slipped our weights and arose slowly to the surface, the rose and Nile green of the Atlantean spires dropping slowly behind us. Only once did I look down in our journey, and not until then did I realize that the seaweed from the Atlantean temple had followed us, was in fact dogging our very heels. The stuff hovered there on the surface for a minute after we had climbed aboard the Nautilus, and then, as if pulled by some unseen hand from below, it slowly sank from sight. I come now to a point in my story where I am loath to continue, for it must reveal in me an atavistic strain, the existence of which, until this last accursed cruise of the Nautilus, I had never suspected. As may be guessed from the preceding narrative, neither Dr. Tyrrell nor myself had ever married, our labors and researches having provided us with a diversity of experience which rendered unnecessary a venture into other fields of existence. Up until the time of the last cruise of the Nautilus, I can say with certainty that no woman, nor even any thought of woman, has ever disturbed the quiet tenor of my emotional life. For my colleague, I think I can say the same. Hence it was somewhat a shock to me when I awoke during that night to find the lovely, sensual face of the exquisite Winona haunting me, there in the darkness of my cabin. For a time the sensation was a pleasant one. I felt a warm invigoration of my being, a sensuous flow of hot blood in my body which, although slightly tempestuous, was not without a certain indefinable charm. I remember that I reached back to the headboard of my bed, seized there the enamel rail, and stretched myself in the warm luxury of the tropic night. I felt remade, a new thing. I felt that in some indefinable way nature had poured into me renewed health, renewed youth. I wanted to arise, to pace about my cabin. I wanted to go to the decks of the Nautilus, to race up and down, cloaked only in the star-spangled robe of the equatorial night. I felt that I had the power to reach out and embrace the whole world. For a time I lay there enjoying to the full this entirely new reaction and speculating on the psychological aspect of my new inspiration. In a little while, however, I began to grow too warm. The hot blood pounding through my veins became in a very few minutes a source of complete and profound and wholly inexplicable irritation. In vain I attempted to throw off the mood. In vain I attempted all the known tricks of wooing sleep. In vain I tossed and tumbled about with the gentle rolls of the Nautilus. Eventually I arose, drew on my dressing gown, for I had thrown aside my pyjamas when the mood first came upon me, and thus attired strode out upon the decks. Forward I saw a tiny ruby glow, which I took to be the lighted cigarette of the watch. Above, almost outshone by the brilliance of the Southern Cross, were the riding lights of the Nautilus. All was peace, excepting in my own brain. I strode forward, my irritable mood pricking me onward, and reprimanded the watch for smoking on duty, although I knew such mild breaches of discipline had been winked at by both captain and mate on these long voyages. I remember how, in surprise, he flipped it overboard, the glowing end describing a perfect half-circle as it dropped into the sea. Somehow, even that bothered me. Presently, I walked back toward the stern, and, rounding the corner of the after-deck-house, I came suddenly upon Dr. Tyrrell. He was standing there, half-draped over the rail, and peering intently down into the sea. For some reason unknown to me, I paused there, watching him. He did not move. He might have been a statue of stone gazing over the rail. Again I felt a wave of unreasonable irritation, a veritable sweep of anger. Why should he be standing there, peering so intently down into the sea? Why was he not in his cabin where he belonged at this hour, gaining rest for the labors of tomorrow? Somehow I did not realize then that I was blaming him for the very thing which I myself was doing. As I stood there watching him, He slowly straightened up and lifted his eyes to the stars. His lips were moving, and I thought that he sighed. It was then that I noted, seemingly for the first time in all our relationship, what a handsome figure of a man he was, with his clear-cut, aquiline profile, his full moulded chin, his crisp, curly hair, only slightly tinged with grey at the temples, and that magnificent figure with its tremendous shoulders, flat hips, and gently sloping flanks. Somehow it made me feel small and puny and hopeless. All my newfound vigor drained from me in that moment, and I felt a strange, hot resentment against the man. Suddenly I had come to be old and worn and gnarled and terribly weary. Thinking thus, and without disturbing my colleague, I went back to my cabin and a sleepless vigil into the dawn. That morning, while we were taking breakfast, Dr. Tyrrell told me quietly that there would be no need for my going down that day. "Why?" I asked, somewhat testily, though never before had I questioned his decisions. "It is exhausting work," he replied, "and we do not know how long we can stay here before there may be a storm, in which case we may have to up anchor and run before it. I think we can work best by going down in turn. I today, you tomorrow." His reasoning seemed wholly specious, but I assented sullenly. Throughout the 4 hours of his trip below, I lived in torture. I thought of him down there, walking through those magnificent halls, enjoying the wonders of Atlantis, the attractions of the ancient chapel, the charm of that smiling beauty there in her crystal tomb. Vaguely, I wondered what he would bring up with him, and you may guess that I was somewhat startled when he came up as he had gone down, with nothing at all. That night, for the first time in our long friendship, we had harsh words in his cabin. I upbraided him for bringing up none of the jewels, pointing out that even if he himself had no need for further wealth, some of the rest of us were poor men and could put them to good use. My remark seemed to anger him greatly, and he lost himself in a mighty gust of wrath. "They are not ours," he thundered, towering over me. "Not one jot nor tittle of them shall we take. They are hers. They belong to Winona. You shall not have them." "You are mad," I raged. "You are inhumanly selfish. You at least owe it to these poor men aboard who could be made independent for life. It is not within your right to deny them." All my raging was of no avail, and the next morning I was only partly surprised, though greatly angered, when he told me curtly that only he would go beneath the waters. And for another 4 hours I sat there on the decks of the Nautilus, suffering the tortures of the damned. And again he came up empty-handed. That night we went at it again over the teacups. I raged, I tore, I stamped about the room, but he answered me with gentle words, or more often not at all. For the most part he was peculiarly silent, almost uncannily pleasant. When I had finished my tirade, he got up, but paused on the threshold of his cabin. "Fear not," he said, with a peculiarly quiet smile. "They shall have everything. Every foot of Atlantis shall be theirs. They shall climb its hills, wander through its halls, sun themselves on its terraces. They shall know its every beauty, all its wealth. But for you, my friend, I can promise nothing. You are not wanted down below." His cryptic remark startled me, and I began to wonder if he were not a little mad. That night I lay awake through all the long hours until dawn, thinking not of the jewels, of the wealth in Atlantis, but only of Winona. At dawn I slept a little, and she came in all her gorgeous beauty and mocked me there in my cabin. That day I vowed it should be I who would go below. In that I was vastly mistaken, however. We quarrelled at the rail just before he went over, but he brushed me back and plunged into the sea. I saw his face, laughing up in derision through the glass of his helmet, as he slowly sank from sight. For perhaps an hour I sat there by the rail, until the strain became no longer endurable. Then it was that the bonds of my respect to Dr. Tyrrell's judgment were broken, and I realized of a sudden that there was nothing to keep me from going down even against his wishes. Thinking thus, I got myself into my diving dress and slipped over the side. I landed, by good luck, about halfway up the stairs to the temple. There again before me, I saw that accursed seaweed, but I spurned it quickly aside and climbed the stairs. At the entrance, the wretched stuff attempted to bar my way, but I drew my knife and slashed at it until it drew back. Then I walked into the foyer, and from thence into the chapel. Somehow I knew I should find him there, and I was not disappointed. As the details at the farther end of the hall were revealed to me through the dimness, I saw him kneeling before that altar with his head down across her crystal tomb, his face, behind the glass in his helmet, pressed close to hers. And then I knew that I hated him because he loved her, and because I loved her, and because in some way I knew he was the favored one. For the first time I realized that I, too, had cared nothing for the jewels, that I, too, would have scorned to rifle her chapel. Always it had been Winona, and now he had taken her from me. I hated him with every spark of my soul, every fiber of my being. "Dastard!" I shrieked. "Thus you have beguiled your time. Thus you have hoodwinked us all." I had forgotten that the sound could not penetrate beyond the confines of my helmet, and now it echoed and re-echoed in my steel and rubber prison, ringing and screeching in my ears, until the very blood seemed to well up into my eyes, and the sea before me was a scarlet. Without thought of what I was about to do, I pushed forward, knife in hand. I would kill him there. I would cut him down with as little compunction as I had the seaweed before the portals. But I must be crafty. I had no intention of giving him a chance in fair fight. I would walk up behind him and strike with my knife through the rubber joints at his throat, rip the blade downward to his breast, and leave him there either to drown or bleed to death. How I would laugh as he died, there at the feet of his beauty. What an outcome for his secret tryst. And then a very strange thing happened. There was no way under heaven that he could have known of my approach, for he was kneeling with his back toward me. There was nothing to warn him, no sound from me that could have penetrated that watery space to the ears within his helmet. Yet, while I was still 20 feet away, I saw him get slowly to his feet and turn about, his hand going to the knife at his belt even before he could have realized my purpose. Thus confronted, I brandished my weapon and bade him in our sign language to be prepared, since I intended to kill him or die in the attempt. Scarcely had I finished, when to my utter astonishment he slowly replaced the knife in its sheath and quietly awaited my coming. Taken back though I was, I had no intention of losing my purpose. His very sureness enraged me the more. I strode forward, bending all my weight against the intervening water, holding my blade in readiness. Now I stood before him, and saw his white, sneering face behind the glass. Shrieking aloud with a strange exultation, I raised my weapon to strike. But I never made that stroke. Even as my arm descended in its murderous errand, I felt myself suddenly and helplessly snatched away. It was that accursed seaweed. The damnable stuff had twined about my body as I strode across the hall, and now, as I drew near enough to plunge my weapon home, it had snatched me away. In vain I foamed and fought it, slashing to the right and to the left. In vain I ripped and tore and cut, using my gloved hands where the blade seemed too slow. Where I slashed off yards of the stuff, new tendrils seemed to grow, enveloping my body. Frothing and screaming, kicking and squirming, I was dragged across the hall and out on the steps before the temple. There, despite my weights, the weeds seemed to gather under me, forcing me upward. In but a few minutes, the slowly receding spires of Atlantis told me that I was on my way to the surface. I lay on the bosom of the sea, kicking and screaming, but that diabolical stuff was determined that I should not sink again. Finally, as all strength seemed to be leaving me, I felt myself hauled slowly out of the water. They on board the Nautilus, seeing me struggling there in the water, had slipped a boat hook under the ring at my belt and were pulling me to her decks. But I was crafty. Once on board, I revealed nothing of what had happened, merely pretending that I had been taken with cramps on coming to the surface. Then, very carefully, I laid my plans to kill Dr. Tyrrell as soon as he should return. Secretly, I got out my pistol and a knife, and watched for the ascending bubbles that would tell of his coming. But he never came. I waited there until dusk, waited until the captain came to me in alarm and begged me to go below in search of his missing employer. I should have been glad to go, for another purpose than he thought, but I knew that devilish seaweed would stop me at the outset. Looking over the side, I could see it was lurking there, waiting. Once I was in its clutches, it could hold me there powerless while my quarry came aboard in safety, and my last chance was lost. But I could not tell them this, so I cut a rent in my diving dress, telling them it would be impossible for me to venture below. With the coming of darkness, all thought of my leaving the ship was abandoned, and Dr. Tyrrell's life was despaired of. For myself, I knew that he was still down there keeping his tryst with Winona, and the thought of it made me fairly boil with rage. As the night wore on, I became exhausted with the play of conflicting emotions, and, pretending an illness, I went to my cabin. I must have slept longer than I'd intended, for I had many long dreams in which I saw my colleague in the arms of Winona. The two of them stood there on one of the pillars of Atlantis, mocking me as I struggled with the weeds of the Sargasso. Each dream brought the stuff nearer my throat, while it shook and crushed me, as if I were a rodent in the grip of a python. It had clutched my shoulders and was shaking me again, when I awoke and saw that I was not at the bottom of the sea, but safe in my cabin, with the captain of the Nautilus grasping me frantically by the shoulder. "What is the matter?" I demanded, bounding out of my bed and wondering if Dr. Tyrrell had slipped back during the watches of the night. "The ship is sinking, sir," he said, his voice all a-tremble in the darkness. "You'd best come on deck. There's something wrong. I don't understand it." The man's teeth were actually chattering, and the tones of his voice struck me into a panic. As I stood there, peering at his white face in the gloom, I noticed for the first time that the floor of my cabin had assumed a noticeable angle. The ship appeared to be no longer responding to the roll of the seas, but wobbled and tugged in an uncannily impotent way. Hastily donning an overgarment, I hurried out on deck. The night was starlit, the ocean smooth, save for the gentle undulating billows from which it is never free. And yet the Nautilus was going down by the head. Already the angle of her decks had assumed a higher pitch while I had tarried there in my cabin. At that moment she assumed a slight list to port, the wobble becoming more accentuated with each billow. In the forward part of the vessel there arose a wail of voices from the throats of terror-stricken, helpless men. I turned angrily to the captain and demanded why he had not set the crew to the pumps. "I've tried that, sir," he answered, "and I found there isn't a drop of water in her hold." "It's her anchor, then," I said. "It's probably caught on the bottom, and the rising tide is pulling her under." I am not a nautical man, and this seemed an adequate explanation. "I had the anchor up an hour ago, sir," he answered. "I tried to pull out of here, actually tried to get her under way, but her propellers won't budge, sir. My God, sir, it seems that we're being pulled down. We actually can't move." At that moment, there came a ripping and creaking sound from her hold, followed by another drunken wobble to port, and that, I think, gave me my first inkling of what was really happening to the Nautilus. Running up into the forward part of the ship, I peered over the side, What I saw there pulled a strange cry of exultation from my throat. Under her bowsprit, and I dare say all along the whole length of her keel, were little sucker-like tendrils protruding from the water, worming and squirming their way upward over her smooth, white sides. The Nautilus was in the grip of the Sargasso seaweed. She was being pulled under to Atlantis. Now I understood that gruesome pile of wreckage so far below. I realize that when the world reads this, it will call me mad, and I think for the next few hours perhaps I was. I sprang into the air. I jumped and leaped about the deck. I shouted for very joy. I was going to fool Dr. Tyrrell after all. He had said Atlantis would not take me, but it was taking the Nautilus, and if it took the Nautilus, it must take me. The crew must have gathered from my yells and exclamations of triumph what had happened, for they left off their wails and went to work with hatchets, knives, and axes. The weed, by this time, had crept up almost to the rails, and now, as if realizing it had been discovered, it actually began swarming over the side, onto the decks, and eventually into the masts and rigging. They, poor fellows, chopped and hacked and fought it through most of the night. It was a losing fight. Inch by inch her bow tilted downward. Inch by inch her rounded stern arose toward the heavens. Once they tried to lower her boats, but no sooner had these touched the water than the seaweed fastened its clutches upon them. When the angle of her decks became impossible for further footing, I climbed to her stern rail, where I perched and howled and shrieked in glee. Ah, fool, fool that I was! I had forgotten that Atlantis did not want me. Had I been more clever, had I had more of the cunning of the day before, I should have hidden myself away somewhere in the bows of her and gone down with her to the very depths. She went down at dawn with a dull creaking of strained timbers and a hoarse, despairing gurgle and whistle from the air expelled from her holds. And I, fool, perched there on her stern rail, shrieked and shouted for the very joy of it. One by one I saw their bobbing heads go under. One by one I saw the last bits of wreckage enveloped by that slimy, creeping thing and engulfed forever. At noon, at night, I was still floating on. Again and again I dived, seeking to entangle myself. Again and again I felt myself thrust backward to the surface. The sun, a blistering ball of copper in the sky, sank lower and lower, and with the coming of the night, I believe I must have slept there on the bosom of the Sargasso Sea. There were other days and other nights when I screamed and writhed in raging impotence, for I had come to realize that the sea was only playing with me, waiting there idly for me to die, when I should be carried far from Atlantis and Winona by some swift current. But on the dawn of the third day, a great ship hovered over me, and even against my will I was saved. I come now to the end of my story. I know that the world will judge me mad in the writing of it, but for the world and its judgment I care nothing, for I know whereof I have spoken. I have yet another and longer story to bring to a close, and as I set this down I plan to write my finish to it, out there on the decks of the Brent. Of this Captain Waters knows nothing, for I have his promise that he will not read this until tomorrow. Therefore, on this 3rd day of March, I hereby set my signature to this, my story. Charles Williams Randolph. Well, Randolph's story as he told it to me when we first pulled him aboard the Brent was about the same as his statement, except maybe it wasn't so connected. But, as I said before, we'd no sooner got him aboard than the capful of wind we'd been relying on dropped off and left us in a dead calm, and then things commenced to happen. It was about midnight that night, I guess, when we first noticed the old hooker had stopped rolling and was beginning to wobble in a queer sort of way. I didn't pay much attention to it, but turned in, leaving the deck to the mate. He woke me up about an hour later. She was down by the head, and already in a bad way. I remembered Randolph's yarn about the seaweed then, and so I ran forward to the chains and looked over the side. Well, sir, I could see it there on her cutwater and all around her forefoot. Then there came a creaking and a groaning from her holds, which meant that her bottom must be covered. I had the whole crew piped, and we went to it with axes and knives and everything we could lay our hands on. As heaven is my judge, you could see it a-growing over her sides. It was alive. In no time at all it was on her decks and into her rigging. While we were fighting it out of the main shrouds, it would get into the jigger, and when we get at the jigger it would get up into the mizzen, and so on. Finally, we began to list pretty badly to port, and so I ordered the mate to cut away the fore and jigger, they being the ones that seemed the worst. This helped a little, but not much. And that man, Randolph, he was a fiend. He came out on deck and danced there like a maniac, yelling and singing. He didn't try to interfere with the crew, so we didn't pay any attention to him. After a while, I saw him going below, and I didn't find him until afterward. We were pretty well loaded up with Chilean nitrates, valuable stuff, and so I held on to her cargo as long as I could, hoping we might get her clear. But after a while I saw it was no go. With the cargo out of her, I knew she'd be harder to pull under, but on the other hand, when she was empty, it would be easier for that stuff to pull her over on her beam ends. But it was nip and tuck for our lives then, and to hell with the cargo. So I gave the order for half the crew to open her hatches and get the stuff out. It was in powdered form and packed in sacks, 300 pounds to the sack. We began getting it up as best we could, and no easy job it was, with the list on her and the wobble and all that slimy stuff a-squirming over her both alow and aloft. We dropped about 20 or maybe 30 bags over the side, when one of them broke and spilled into the water. That was what saved us, that bag breaking over the side. I was standing by the rail helping the men, when I saw it spill into the water, and then I noticed there was a hissing and a boiling all about her where the stuff had gone in. And that weed, it just melted away all around her waterline for the distance of 10 feet, curled up and dropped off. That gave me an idea. There was some chemical reaction in that nitrate, which was death to that seaweed. I grabbed the next bag and knifed it open, and we dumped it in. Then I was sure the nitrates would do the trick. Well, sir, we just quit fighting that stuff with knives and axes and went at it with those nitrates. We sprinkled it all over the ship, fore and aft, and then we put the whaleboat over the side and sprinkled the stuff against her sides and as far down as we could get below her waterline. Pretty soon the weed in the rigging began to dry up and wither away, and then she began to roll a bit instead of wobbling. Another 6 hours of it, with most of the cargo overboard, and we were clear. We still had some canvas on her, and a little breeze came along and pushed her out of there. I thought maybe Randolph had thrown himself overboard and had not been noticed during the excitement, but the next day we found him hiding in the afterhold. He said he was waiting for the ship to go down, and that nobody would fool him this time. When I told him she was clear, he began to cry like a child. Then I got him up to my cabin and set him about writing his statement. But I'd forgotten he had a mania for making away with himself. I suppose I'm to blame for that. He went out on the deck afterward. I didn't see what happened, but the mate said he climbed up into the mizzen shrouds and then threw himself down, not into the water, but upon the deck. When we picked him up, he was conscious, but dying. I felt sorry for him, poor devil. He called to me as he lay there dying, and made me promise that I'd bury him as soon as he'd gone. "I can walk back by myself," said he. "I know the way. I'll find her." Well, what could I do? I promised. He went, about half an hour later, smiling a goodbye. We sewed him in one of those sacks, put some scrap iron at his feet, and let him go. I suppose he's down there now, and I hope he found her, whoever she may be. Masquerade by Merle Prout. May I cut in, please? It was as simple as that. Yet, for all the gay masquerade throng, Donald shivered at the voice. He looked at the intruder and was not reassured. Tall and gaunt, the man was clad in the long flowing robes of a priest of ancient Egypt. His eyes were shaded, nearly covered by the black hood of his mask, but as he looked into them, Donald had the uncanny impression of looking across a great, dark void. Below the line of the mask, the face was thin and creased, yellowed like old parchment. With the barest trace of a smile, the intruder bowed and said again, "If you don't mind." Donald hesitated. Strangely, he felt his partner would not object if he were to refuse the very usual request. But to refuse would be unthinkable. He released his partner, and in a moment the tall man had whirled her away. Yet Donald was aware of her gaze upon him as he threaded across the crowded floor. Away from the dancers, he paused and looked for the first time at the card she had slipped into his hand. Leonora Starr. The name was printed in simple pica type. Beyond that, the card was blank. He frowned at first, then smiled. She so obviously expected him to see her again. He recalled with pleasure her lithe surrender to his arms while they danced, the warmth with which she had pressed the small card into his hand. Who was she, he wondered. The name Leonora Starr told him nothing. They had met less than 5 minutes before, and even then had spoken but little. The music of the waltz rose to a higher, more exciting strain. Donald searched the crowd with his eyes until he found her, still dancing with the mysterious stranger. They were at the south end of the ballroom now, near the door that led into the garden. The tall man, Donald noted, danced gracefully but stiffly, as though he had once been an excellent dancer, but was now long out of practice. Across the crowd, Donald caught Leonora's eye, and something flashed between them. An appeal, he thought it was. His pulse raced while he stared across the intervening space, and then his glance clashed with that of the giant. He was conscious of the same chilling sensation at the pit of his stomach, as though he were falling, felt the same prickling at the roots of his hair. Then, in another whirl of the dance, the man had turned away. A little group of people nearby was not dancing. Donald strolled toward them, halted halfway, and looked back across the floor. He felt a light touch at his elbow. "That man who tagged you, who is he?" said Betty Cosgrove as he turned. She was obviously agitated. "I've been wondering. Doesn't anyone know?" "No, except that he wasn't invited." "Are you sure? It might be just the costume." "No, none of the guests is so tall. Besides, he wasn't announced." She shuddered. He looks like a death's head or a mummy. If he asks me to dance, I'll faint." Abruptly, the music ceased, to be replaced by the hum of voices and scattered applause. Apprehensive now, in spite of himself, Donald shouldered his way through the crowd in search of Leonora. She was not on the floor. Hurriedly, he surveyed the guests again. The man, too, had disappeared. The garden, perhaps? Quickly he stepped to the door. There was no moon, but the garden was dimly lighted by a single Japanese lantern hung near the center. Donald could see no one. Dense shrubbery bordered the walks, and in the far corner a thick grove of trees loomed black in the shadows. He drew a deep breath and walked swiftly toward it. Behind him the music began again, a haunting Viennese melody in waltz time. He looked back at the lighted windows. People in their brilliant costumes were again taking the floor. No one else had come out after him. To all appearances, he was alone in the garden. He hesitated, half-minded to turn back. Fool's errand. Suddenly, above the music, he heard a woman scream, a muffled scream that was not repeated. It came from the grove of trees. His heart leaping, he turned and ran toward it, searching his pockets for a weapon as he went. There was none. He reached the trees. It was not as dark there as it had seemed. The level rays of the Japanese lantern, though dim, shone redly through the shadows. Suddenly, in his haste, he stumbled over a creeper of vine, and, catching himself, stopped short at the sight before him. At this spot, the heavy growth of trees gave way to a circular clearing, and the ground was covered by a lush carpet of grass. The light of the Japanese lantern seemed to filter undiminished through the trees, and become amplified at this spot, so that everything which occurred was as clear to the watcher as in the light of day. And at the very center of the circle, at the top of a small rise, was the horrifying tableau. Leonora was lying on her side, her face half buried in the grass. Over her, his knee on her shoulder, his left hand covering her mouth, was the tall man in the priestly robe. In his right hand he held aloft a glittering knife with a long curved blade, which he held poised in a perpetual threat. He had not yet struck. The man, dishevelled by the struggle, could be seen better now. From the arm which held the knife aloft, the robe had fallen away, revealing it to the shoulder. It was thin as bone. It had the appearance of bone, stretched tightly over with a yellow, parchment-like skin. His headdress was lost, revealing a smooth, hairless head which seemed deathly white even in the red rays of the lantern. The mask, too, was gone, and his eyes. In the shadows they appeared like something which Donald, if he were to remain sane, dared not think about. A cold perspiration beaded his skin. Donald looked about him for a weapon, while the two before him held the same motionless pose. A stone, a broken limb of a tree, any weapon would suffice. If only the demon did not strike, if only Leonora could hold him back a moment longer. In his excitement he never wondered why he had not already done so, why, if he wished to kill, he had not killed and fled minutes before. Nor did he wonder how Leonora, facing death, could wait for it so passively. If he had stopped to think of those things, to realize their meaning, perhaps he might have noticed other, more obvious circumstances, that the music, which had sounded so loudly in the garden a few seconds before, had died to nothing the moment he had entered the hellish grove, that the light breeze from out of the west no longer fanned his cheek, and now did not even rustle the leaves of the trees, that the very starlight seemed to drip unwillingly through the interlaced branches overhead. 20 feet to the left, Donald saw a spade leaning against a tree. He started for it, but at that moment a sudden burst of activity on the part of Leonora freed her mouth, and she called weakly, "Quickly, help!" Being young, Donald could not resist that appeal. He left the spade untouched, and turned and ran to fling himself against the gaunt attacker. With a single bound, the other rose to meet his attack, the knife drawn to strike, the lips snarling. The girl, too, rose to her feet and stood. "Back to the house, Leonora! Run!" shouted Donald. He had halted, crouched ready to spring, 10 feet from the towering skeleton before him. But the girl stood still, apparently tense with excitement. "You must kill him," she hissed, "or he'll kill me." "Who is he?" Donald rasped. "He's a priest," she lied. "His name is Osman." Donald knew that she was lying, though he could not tell how he knew it, nor why she was. "Go to the house," he said again, "and send some men out. I'll keep him here." A sardonic smile twisted the features of Osman. "You don't want me alone," he taunted. In that instant it happened. Leonora had crept up behind the priest. Suddenly she charged him, grasped the hand that held the knife. The priest swung upon her, ready to crash a heavy fist upon her face. Donald rushed in. He caught the blow in the chest. It staggered him. Then, with all his power, he flung himself forward and closed. Donald was athletic. In college, he had been a member of the wrestling team, had been rated fair at boxing. But he knew in a second that he had underrated his opponent. The arms of this fleshless skeleton were like bands of steel, the legs as firm as if rooted in the ground. Suddenly, Osman laughed. He tossed the knife from him, picked Donald up bodily, whirled him through the air until he was dizzy, then threw him to the ground with stunning force. Then he dropped quickly upon him and pinned his arms to the ground. Donald lay on his back in the grass, helpless, staring up at the twin caverns of the monster's eyes. A wave of revulsion shook him, left him weak and pale, his body wet with sweat. Those eyes again! Was he insane? But he knew that he was not. This was real. This was happening. Back there, behind those trees, was the ballroom, and a gay throng, and music and laughter. And here, this. His mind, stimulated by terror, worked fast. The knife. It had been lost in the struggle. Then, surely, Leonora. He twisted his head to look for her. She was standing on his left, 10 feet away, her eyes shining, her lips slightly parted. He called to her. "Find the knife, and hurry," he said. She made no reply, but stood smiling, neutral. A gleam in the grass near her caught his eye. "What's the matter? It's there at your feet. Help me," he shouted. As she made no move, he realized that she would not. But what was to be done he must do for himself. A black rage gave new strength to his arms. She must be in league with the priest. She had confessed to knowing him. He saw now that he had been lured into this unequal contest. But why? The priest tightened his hold on Donald's arms again, so that Donald writhed with the pain. "Why are you holding me? What do you want?" he cried at last. "Only your body," said Osman softly. His body? The man was insane. If only he could reach the knife, if he could get an arm free. He feigned a struggle, edging toward the knife as he fought. When he was again overcome, he was 2 feet nearer. He rested. Then another struggle, another 2 feet gained. He had a feeling the priest was playing with him as a cat plays with a mouse, encouraging him to escape and then dashing his hopes. Well, there might be a surprise. 2 more pretended struggles, and the knife was within his reach. Now, if an arm were free. Suddenly, the priest bent his head low, so that his fetid breath seared the nostrils of the prostrate man. "I'm going to kill you now," he said. Simultaneously, he loosed Donald's arms and clutched his neck with bony fingers. Donald felt the breath in his lungs pent up, fighting for escape while he flailed his left arm in search of the knife. He grasped the smooth handle, balanced it a moment in his hand. He focused his staring eyes upon the figure leaning low over him, aimed his blow well. As he struck, the priest inclined his head to the left, leaving a clean path for the knife. It severed the veins in his neck. At once, Donald felt his body galvanized as from an electric shock. He was aware of a mighty force penetrating his brain. Red flashes seemed to shoot from the priest's eyes to play into his own. Giddiness and nausea as in a violent earthquake racked his consciousness. And then, for a moment, he fainted away. When he again opened his eyes, the scene was, to all appearances, unchanged. Over him were the same trees, the same... He raised his hand to a gutting pain in his throat, felt something warm spurt over it. He looked. Blood. But surely this was not his own hand. This was thin and bony. The garment which covered the arm was not his own either, but white and flowing, the garment of a priest. The words of Osman resounded in his brain like a death knell. "I want your body." And now his dimming eyes beheld a scene which tore his soul with despair. A man, clad as he had been, with the same proud tilt of the head, the same athletic carriage, but with eyes which glittered strangely now in the pale light, stepped toward a beautiful girl. "Come, Leonora," he said, in a voice which Donald recognized as his own. "It is time to go." She looked at him with a slow smile. "You really are very, very handsome, Osmond," she answered. And as the eyes of the prostrate figure slowly filmed in death, the now perfectly matched pair looked back at him and laughed with wild abandon.
Candlelight by Louise Garwood. David closed the great oak door behind his departing guests, happy at last to hear their laughter and their footsteps mingle with the patter of the rain outside. How long they had stayed and tried him by their good-natured talk, and they could never have understood why he wanted to be alone. Now his silent house was left all to him, and he might abandon his mind to the memories which seemed to creep like spectres from the dusty corners and faded curtains, to the strange dream that he had borne in his heart so long. He walked across the thick carpet to the fireplace where the embers were smouldering and casting a glow on the hearth. From overhead, on the mantel, the light of the candelabra flickered and danced down about his greying hair. He heard the drip-drip of the rain on the casement sills. Then a gust of wind crowded the drops into a flurry. "Hush, hush," it seemed to say. Was it wind, or a sigh? He started. There was the odour of violets again. He walked to the window and opened it so that the damp air blew upon him, and his face twisted in his effort to speak aloud, but he could only whisper, "Eleanor." Drip, drip, patter, patter, answered the rain. He closed the window and, sighing, went back to stare once more at the embers and press his temples with cold fingers. Yes, she would come. She would come back to the old house, which had grown musty and dismal for want of her, to him, David, whose heart had grown musty and dismal for want of her. She had promised to come back again some time in early spring, and he had waited through the years, so long that his hair had grown touched with grey and his face had become lined. But now it would be different. He knew that she was near. Else, why that sound of muffled footsteps he had heard of late, sometimes following, sometimes going before him over the velvet carpet, through the lonely halls, the swish of curtains that moved as if from a person passing by, the odour of violets here and there, her violets, and strangest of all, the little yellowed handkerchief he had found in the carven chair. The handkerchief belonged in the chest where he kept the trifles she had once used. Around it, too, clung the breath of violets, together with the same odour that was given forth by the sunless rooms downstairs. The chest was always locked, yet he had found the kerchief. "Eleanor, where are you?" His own voice startled him. He suddenly saw that the ashes in the grate were no longer smouldering rosily. They were getting grey. It must be time for him to go to bed. So after he had put the screen around the fireplace, he began to extinguish the light on the mantel, taking one from its socket to guide him up the stairway. The last one of all he left burning. For her, he thought, and gave a whimsical smile. Then he turned and left the room to its fantastic shadows, to the whisper of the wind, to that soft laughter, which was really the patter of raindrops against the sills. Above, on the high ceiling, danced the flickering light of the candle, while before him, gaunt and tall, moved his own shadow, and it fluttered ahead as he hastened up the steps. At the landing, where the stairway divided into two smaller flights, he turned, and after ascending the one that led to the right wing of the house, crossed the narrow hall into his room. Here, with fresh tapers lighted, and his favourite armchair and books, it did not seem so lonely. Yet he did not wish to read. He wanted to open the small chest and look at its array of relics one by one. When he unlocked it, a musty sweetness stole out. Sitting there, he fingered the yellow handkerchief, the silk fan with flowers painted on it, the gloves, yellow also now. The human hands that had worn them could never touch his again. Tears and prayers might bring her spirit back, but they could never restore those warm hands to his clasp. Then he unfolded a scarf. How sheer and delicate it was, like her. How it breathed of her. He buried his face in it. "Oh, my dear, you promised. I have waited so long. Aren't you coming back? It has been lonely, Eleanor." The scarf fell from his hands. What was that noise? He rose, straining to hear, peering out into the darkness of the stair landing, then sank back again. Of course, the casement in the library. It had not been repaired, and the March wind was making it rattle, but he had best not worry to go down and fasten it. There were other things to look at, as if he had not gone over them 1,000 times before. The pretty brooch, the comb, the letters written in faded ink. He was reading one of these letters when, as the wind died down, he heard through the steady pour of the rain a sound that was not the rattling of the casement. It was distinct and clear. Click, clack. David wanted to go to the door, but he could not move except to rise and stand motionless in front of his chair as the kerchief, brooch, and letters fell and scattered on the floor. His heart beat hard and sent a wave of red into his face. Click, clack. A footstep on the uncarpeted stair, the light touch of a woman's slipper. Click. The rain came steadily down. He waited. The visitor seemed to have paused. In a moment, the steps began again and came up slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 13 before the landing could be reached. Click, clack, click. 8, 9, 10. Clack. At last he saw something. It was an aureole of light, which, as the steps came nearer, grew into a semicircle. Candlelight, but no shadow fell before it. Advancing within the light was the outline of a head of dark hair, then a white neck and shoulders, until finally, upon the landing, stood a slim figure clad in a pale robe. A hand rose to shade the candle, and slowly the figure turned and looked up toward him with large eyes. A thick braid fell over each shoulder. David tried to hold out his arms. They were leaden. "Eleanor!" he tried to call. Only a gasp came from between his parted lips, and she stayed there a minute, smiling, then came toward him up the smaller steps. Click, clack, click. Very slowly, and after crossing the hall, she stood in the doorway of his room. There she paused again, and those tender words of welcome, which he had yearned to say through all the years, would not come. A strange timidity held him back from her. He wanted to fall upon his knees and cry. At last, he uttered halting words. You have come." "Yes, David, I have come." Her voice was calm and sweet. She advanced. Her dainty slippers touched the carpet noiselessly, and her long garment dragged behind with a sighing sound. When she had reached the table where the lights were, she put her candle in an empty bracket, then sat down upon a low stool facing David. It did not seem that she thought of coming nearer. How different this was from the meeting he had dreamed of. His own voice was calm as he said, "Why did you not come before? I have waited so long, darling. He stepped toward her, but leaned back against the table as he saw that she shrank away. Her eyes grew wide. "It has not been long. It has only been a little while." The wind whined through the gables outside. David watched her draw the white robe close around her, while a new loneliness arose in his heart. "Has it seemed short to you, then?" "Oh, the long, long years, Eleanor. They have made me old. And you say, a little while." Why were they so strangely calm? Why were they not in each other's arms with that sweet, warm embrace of old? The smile was gone from her lips now. She said mournfully, "I have tried to come to you so many, many times, and I could not. Sometimes I was at your window, whispering to you. Then I would laugh and tap on the panes, but you never heard." "How could I know?" He shook his head. She sighed, and it seemed that there were violets in the room. "I am glad to be here. I am glad to be near you, David, because—" She drew the robe close about her again. "It was lonely and cold." David shuddered. Where? Where was it lonely and cold? She made a vague gesture that caused the open sleeve to fall back from her arm. "Out there." After a few minutes, she looked down at the things which lay on the floor at their feet, and the open chest. "What are these?" Once more that queer loneliness. "Don't you know, Eleanor? Surely you remember." "No." "Why, they are your own. Your letter, dear, the comb you wore in your hair." How small and like a child she looked as she slipped down from the stool and knelt among the relics. She held up the yellowed handkerchief and looked at him with a question in her eyes. "This, David," she said. I remember." He shuddered again. After that, she looked no more at the things, but straight up into his eyes. "I like to be here," she said simply. "It is warm and sweet where you are, David." His heart beat faster as he looked down and saw something of the old light burning in those strange eyes. "And I am old, Eleanor. I grew old when you left me. Everything grew old and musty and dismal when you went away." He motioned to the ceiling, with bits of cobwebs in its corners, to the faded carpet. "But you are young and beautiful." She gave a laugh that sounded like the patter of rain against the casement. "No, no, it is you who are young. I am not young." The eerie laugh pattered again. "David, She seemed to be groping for words she could scarcely remember. "I love you." She rose. She stretched out her white arms. She was coming toward him. He shivered and grew cold as she came nearer. Her arms touched him. He shrank away. They encircled him. He tried to pull back, but he was held by terror. Her icy lips were seeking his. The fragrance of violets was heavy in his nostrils, and deathly and heavier still, the damp, moist odor of the mold around their roots. Don't!" he cried. "You are— Oh, God, go away!" The white arms fell from around him, and she cringed. He looked into eyes of unutterable sadness. Then she covered her face with her slender hands and rocked her body to and fro, moaning, "Oh, oh, oh! I tried and tried to come, and I came to you at last, and you were afraid. You are afraid of me." He could not speak. He clung to the table, weeping. The mournful voice went on, "I must go away, and it will be lonely and cold, and I can never come back any more." Slowly, she went over to where the candles burned and lifted one from the bracket, shading it with her hand. She turned her piteous face toward him again, crooning the words over and over to herself, as if they were a weird song. You were afraid. And now she was walking through the doorway, the long garment trailing behind her, the dark braids swinging loosely. David could not follow. Come back! Come back! He tried to call, but the words were only a whisper. Click, clack, click, clack. Then click, clack again, farther and farther away. He listened and watched until the halo of light grew smaller and smaller, and the footsteps died off in the silence, while the wind and rain outside sounded as if they took up the burden of her moaning. Oh, 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 I came to you, and you were afraid. A sharp pain. David jerked his head up. It had struck the wooden chest that lay on his knees. How strange. He could not remember having sat down again, or having gathered the things from the floor. Stranger still, the candles, which had been only half burned when she was there, flickered fitfully in their sockets, ready to expire. One at a time, the flames fluttered and went out. The next morning was bright and sunshiny, the sky all blue, and the trees and flowers were fresher from last night's rain. As David looked out the window, the air was sweet, and he saw that the gardener had been putting out new violet plants. From all around the garden, their blooms looked up at him with bright faces, where drops of moisture lingered, shining like tears. Later, as he walked down the staircase, he found spots of candle drip all the way, and the last socket of the brass candelabrum on the mantel was empty.
The Parasitic Hand by R. Anthony. Notes from the Diary of Dr. Bernstrom. 1. The External Hand. June 6th, 1925. This morning I encountered the strangest case of my 20 years of practice. John Pendleton, a young real estate agent of Cassia City, requested a physical examination, particularly of a growth on his left side. After he had stripped, I saw that he had a bandage taped to his side. Upon removal of the bandage, the growth proved to be a completely formed right hand, its base or wrist fastened at the curve of the 11th rib, directly beneath the armpit. The hand was slightly open, the palm turned outward and upward. In size, it was that of a babe several months old. "How long have you had this?" I asked Pendleton. "Always, as far back as I can remember," he answered. "I was born with it, so I was told, but it wasn't always the same size." I looked up in surprise. "Not the same size? What do you mean?" He hesitated and flushed. "Well, it was—" He made a quick gesture and added energetically, "Doctor, don't think me a fool or an imaginative idiot. I'm a college man and not given to silly imaginings. It's the truth I'm telling you, remember. That hand used to be small, very small, but in the last 3 months this hand has been growing steadily, and you see its present size." A parasitic hand it was, clearly so. I knew the thing, for I had seen such structures before. But a growing hand, and growing after the host had reached maturity, that seemed impossible. By accident, I placed an index finger against the palm of the hand. Immediately, its fingers closed upon my forefinger and gripped it firmly. Here was surprise. Usually, these parasitic growths are inactive, without nerves, and provided with a very scant blood supply. But the grip of this parasitic hand was firm and strong, like that of a babe. It took considerable effort to release my finger, so tenacious was the grip. And After I had freed myself, it continued to close and open, much like a small babe's, and finally made an infant fist. Pendleton nodded as he observed the experiment. "That's what it does to me," he said, "but only since the last 6 weeks. It never did that before then. Now it's a nuisance. It clutches at everything I put on, at my underwear, my shirt, my pajamas. The only way I can keep it from pulling and tearing at my clothes is to bandage it and tape it fast to my body. Even then I feel it wriggle and clutch at things. It's bothered me a lot. What does this mean, Doctor?" "Well," I hesitated. "Go ahead, Doctor," Pendleton urged. "I've been told that it's a sort of parasite, but I don't understand exactly. How the deuce can an extra hand be a parasite? Why should a hand grow from my side? Remember, I was born with it." "You probably were a twin," I explained, "at least in the early stages of your embryonic life. In fact, you and the twin probably came from a single egg. Identical twins, you know, come from a single fertilized egg. Sometimes such twins are equally developed. More often, one twin is better developed than the other. What it means is that the twins compete with each other during embryonic and fetal life, and one may develop at the expense of the other. As a matter of fact, one twin may absorb the other, sometimes completely so, sometimes leaving a few traces such as a hand or foot. Apparently you absorbed your twin nearly completely. This hand is all that is left of him." "Well, I'll be hanged," Pendleton ejaculated in wonderment. "But I clearly see how that is possible, and that your explanation fits. But look here, Doctor. Then in a way I must be two personalities merged in one body, myself and the other twin." He paused, and his eyes grew wide with some astonishing thought. "Doctor, do you suppose that the personality, the soul of the other twin is still intact, and is now trying to establish itself in this growing hand?" "Of course not," I said firmly. But while I photographed him and bandaged the hand, the idea suggested by his question kept revolving in my mind. I may as well put down my ideas of the matter. If the interpretation of twins is correct, then Pendleton is the autocyte, and the hand is all that is left of the parasite. But what became of the personality, the soul of the parasite, when its body was merged into that of the stronger twin, the autocyte? If we allow it entity, then the fact that the parasitic hand, after being dormant for 23 years, is now growing, would seem to indicate that the parasite was dominated by Pendleton until he had attained his full development, and that now the dormant personality of the other twin is asserting itself and trying to establish its own proper self. A strange theory, yet it seems to fit. How else account for the growth? June 7th, 1925. I have the general photographs and the X-rays before me. The X-rays show that the hand is completely formed, all carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges being clear and of proper shape. A rudiment of radius and ulna are present, but fade away near the point of attachment of the hand. The muscles and fascia of the hand are attached to the intercostal muscles below the 11th rib. Blood supply from an intercostal artery. A doubtful spot may be a ganglion for the nerve supply. June 15th, 1925. Pendleton in again today, after a week's absence from town. At my question, "How is the hand getting on?" he answered shortly, "See for yourself, Doctor." He stripped, and I proceeded to remove the tape and bandages. I started back when I saw the hand. "Why, it has grown," I exclaimed. "It seems twice as large as last week, like that of a child of 5 or 6 years." Pendleton nodded grimly. "That's why I told you to see for yourself, Doctor. I wanted you to be sure about that fact. What are you going to do with it?" "Remove it," I said firmly. "This week. It should not be a very serious matter." A queer look came into Pendleton's eyes. "You don't suppose that, in removing this what is left of my twin, we would be, doing murder?" I smiled at the fancy. "No, hardly. You may liken this hand to a tumor. Removal of a tumour does not constitute murder, does it? A tumour is a parasitic growth. This hand is a parasitic growth. We remove parasitic growths before they become too dangerous. Murder? Well, no, he said. But I had a crazy dream about it the other night, he added apologetically. I dreamed I saw my twin, and that he said, "You have had your share of life at my expense. Now I want my own. Don't you dare tamper with things. I'm going to have my way." And then I woke up. Rather obvious, I commented. A natural sequence of our conversation of twin entities, or rather of one twin overcoming the other. Nothing to it, my boy. I patted him on the shoulder. What do you say about 3 days from now? That will give you time to prepare. Not a serious operation, you understand, but it is good to be prepared. He assented, and after taking a few more photographs, I dismissed him. July 21st, 1925. San Francisco, California. A telegram just received from Pendleton. Come back to operate. Urgent. The illness and death of my father had called me to California before I could operate on Pendleton, and the disposition of the estate required a longer absence than contemplated. I wired back, on way in 2 days. Expect me by 25th. July 26th, 1925. Back in Cassius City. Pendleton met me at the station this afternoon. He looked pale and thin and haunted. Despite the heat, he was shivering. "Thank God you have come, Doctor," he cried. "I'm going insane." I looked at him curiously. "You don't mean that the hand—" It's growing, Doctor." His eyes held a wild and frightened look. "It is larger, and a part of the forearm has grown out." I stared at him in unbelief. "Hardly possible," I said. "But it is, Doctor," he insisted. "Doctor, you haven't known me for a fool. This thing has given me no rest for a month. It is always twisting and pulling, as if it were trying to reach into me for something. It's driving me mad." Cold terror was in his voice. The taxi stopped at my office, and we hurried in. Pendleton stripped quickly and jerked off the bandages. There! He was right. The hand had grown, and now was the size of that of a vigorous boy of 14 or 15. But, in addition, the lower half of a forearm had grown out. July 27th, 1925. Remove the parasitic hand from Pendleton's side this morning. Would not repeat the operation for $1 million. It was a terrifying experience. General and local anesthetics used. But while P responded excellently, the parasitic hand remained active. In fact, it seemed to be animated with a fighting spirit. It seized the wrist of one of the surgical nurses during the preliminaries and held it in a relentless grip so that she fainted in horror. Later, when I proceeded to make the first incision, it seized my wrist and, with remarkable force, tried to direct the scalpel toward Pendleton's heart. Only by dropping the scalpel did I avoid stabbing P to death. I then applied anesthetics to the hand itself, with no appreciable results. Finally, in desperation, I pushed a wad of cotton into the hand, threw a loop around its wrist, and had one of the nurses hold it taut. By thus misleading and misdirecting its efforts, I was able to proceed. How silly these words sound, as if I had been dealing with a separate entity, and yet that seems to be the only plausible assumption that would help to explain. Throughout the operation, the hand kept up its writhing and clutching motions. As I made the final cut, it jerked loose from my hand, fell to the floor, and then fastened around the ankle of the chief surgical nurse. In horror, she dropped the instrument, screamed hysterically, and ran out of the operating room and fainted in the hallway. I darted after her and removed the fiendish hand. Even then it kept up its autonomous struggle. It was with a feeling of relief that I dropped it into a jar filled with preservative and returned to complete my work on Pendleton. I was careful to remove all traces of the attaching structures, and also treated the vestiges with X-rays to destroy all rudiments of the growth. The operation, though simple and normally requiring perhaps half an hour, lasted nearly 4 hours because of the constant interference of the parasitic hand. Brent, the intern in charge of the anesthesia, the 3 nurses and I were complete wrecks at the end of the ordeal. After we wheeled the operating table from the room and turned the patient over to the special nurse, we found that the nurses had fallen to the floor, either in a faint or exhausted. Brent looked over the room. "Rather like a shambles today," he remarked in ghoulish humor. I nodded and dropped into a chair and knew no more. I believe I fainted also. August 10th, 1925. Pendleton dismissed from the hospital today. Only a circular scar indicates the position of the parasitic hand. 2. The internal hand. March 5th, 1926. Pendleton dropped in this morning. He looked worried and thoughtful. "You're not sleeping well, my boy," I told him. "You wouldn't sleep well either, Doctor, if you felt something clawing within you." I manifested surprise. "What do you mean?" He smiled wearily. "Exactly what I said. Something clawing and pulling within me, and right at the place where that hand was removed." I muttered. "That sounds rather curious. Call it crazy, but I know what it is like. It is as if a hand were gripping lightly, shoving things aside, pulling at me as if somebody— Doctor, that hand is coming back." I looked sharply at him. No, he did not look silly. Of course, like other physicians, I knew that the imagination can produce astonishing delusions. But Pendleton did not seem to me to be of that sort. "Strip and get up on the examination table," I ordered tersely. With a sigh, he obeyed. I could find little. The circular scar showed signs of disappearing. Below it, the abdomen seemed faintly distended, but not enough to be symptomatic. The stethoscope revealed only the normal sounds, and palpation was similarly uninforming. "Let's see what an X-ray will show," I suggested. March 6th, 1926. Just examined the X-ray prints. Nothing important indicated, no signs of congestion as in a tumorous growth. I went back through the files for the X-rays taken last June. Comparison showed that some of the internal organs had been displaced. The stomach, for one, was pushed to the right a distance of nearly 2 inches. This discovery surprised me, and in my astonishment I dropped the print. I bent down to pick it up, and jerked back in amazement. For, from a distance, I saw what had escaped me in a closer view. A hand was outlined within the body, to the left of the stomach. I picked up the print and examined it carefully. No, it was not a positive structure. It was merely that certain structures had been pushed aside, and that the vacated portion had the outline of a hand. No evidence of actual entity, only the hand-like outline. A puzzling case. Is Pendleton right in saying that the hand had returned? But it isn't an actual structure. A phantom, then? March 15th, 1926. Pendleton complains of internal pains and difficulty in breathing. I have prescribed sedatives. March 20th, 1926. Pendleton ordered to the hospital last night. Another X-ray taken with orders to rush. Just examine the plate. The hand-shaped space has increased in size and has pushed upward. The technician called my attention to it, so she has noticed it too. But there is no sign of a tumor, just an absence of structures, an outline of a hand. What to do? March 22nd, 1926. Pendleton suffering and in agony. "It's reaching for my heart," he groaned. "Can't you do something, Doctor?" I gave him a strong sedative. After that I discussed with Brent the chances of an operation. But operate for what? After that I went to the surgery and told the nurses of the possibility of operating on P in a day or two. Miss Cummings, the chief surgical nurse, and her two assistants paled at the announcement, and then did something rather unethical. They refused. "No," said Miss C. with a shiver. "No, doctor. I can't work with you on that case. I should faint with terror." The two assistants expressed themselves similarly. "Please, doctor, don't ask me," said Miss Cummings. I'll never forget how that thing seized my ankle." She collapsed at the recollection and began to cry softly. "Do you wish Pendleton to die without a chance?" I asked gravely. "I must do something. I am afraid, but I do not know what to do. I do not know what is troubling him. He is suffering, that is evident. The X-rays tell too little. As it is, I must proceed on a pure guess. I do not know what I'll find, but it is Pendleton's only chance. That is, if you will do your duty." Duty? The appeal to duty was effective. Miss Cummings smiled faintly and said in a low voice, "Very well, doctor. I'll try." Her assistants nodded in fearful assent. March 23rd, 1926. The climax came this morning. I was making the rounds of the patients and stopped in Pendleton's room. He had slept quietly last night, he said. "Still, I feel queer, doctor, as if things had come to a decision, sort of ready for the final battle. It's going for my heart, I know, trying to take my life for its own. Can't you do something, doctor?" I reassured him and remarked that we would probably operate on him tomorrow. "Thank God," he muttered. "I don't think I can stand this much longer. Do you think you can rid me of this, whatever it is?" "I hope so," I answered. "In fact," I added, quite contrary to my actual belief, "I feel sure that I can. I've been studying up this matter and know something definite now." My fabulation gave him confidence, and he seemed more cheerful. So I left him and went down the corridor to see other patients. Scarcely 10 minutes later, I heard a fearful scream, a choking cry of "Help!" I rushed into the hallway and saw the nurses making for Pendleton's room, but they stopped at his door and shrank back. I ran up and pushed them aside. Pendleton was in a turmoil, his bed a cyclone of whirling sheets and blankets. He was twisting, tumbling, and bounding up and down, his groans fearful to hear. Just a few seconds, then the sheets were whipped aside, and I saw Pendleton. His face was red, eyes bloodshot and staring glassily, the mouth wide open, chin pendant, and tongue protruding. He's got me," he gasped. His body rocked uncertainly on his lips in a rotary motion. A final "ah!" Then he snapped erect and fell over on his side. Pendleton was dead. I tried restoratives, but it was no use. The coroner, Dr. Bidwinkle, performed the autopsy, in which I helped him. We found the abdominal organs pushed aside as indicated in the X-rays. Just above this, the diaphragm was ruptured, the lung shoved aside, the pericardium ripped open. The heart was contracted and furrowed, as if a fully grown hand had squeezed it until it stopped beating. Dr. Bidwinkle was astounded. "Of all the crazy things," he muttered. So I told him of the case, and also showed him the photographs. "Hell!" he exclaimed, after I had concluded. "You and I, Bernstrom, don't know it all. I think you're right, but we can't afford to expose ourselves to possible ridicule. Your X-rays and witnesses wouldn't convince 1 out of 10 physicians. There are some people that you simply can't convince, so why bother? Here's what I propose to put down on the certificate. Death from hemorrhage induced by internal rupture. Do you agree?" "Yes, it will be better that way," I said. "But kindly note this," I added, turning to Pendleton's body. I reached over and placed the fingers of my hand, the right hand, into the impressions or furrows of Pendleton's heart. The fingers and thumb fitted the grooves. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,